So welcome everyone. I see you guys are getting in. Like I said, as you can see, we have a small timer before we begin, and then we will start with Power BI Dataflows. We're just doing a small little audio check, so this should all be listened. Here in 3, 2, 1, and hopefully that worked, and it muted and you couldn't hear me. So excited you're all here. Like I said, we about 8 minutes. We're gonna get going. We got to make sure we're unmuted here, but hello and welcome everyone here to another Learn with the Nerds event. So hopefully everyone here is excited, ready to go. Today is all going to be about Power BI Dataflows, as you might expect. Hopefully that makes sense, so it isn't going to be too confusing as we cover this content and this material. Now, a couple of things. Let me actually go ahead and get this nice little slide deck open. We're going to put here in the chat a little link that you can go ahead and you can download the actual PowerPoint itself. It's actually the PDF representation of what we'll be going through, because we got a lot of stuff that we're going to be covering in these 3 hours, right? So we're starting now, we'll go to 2. If we end a little bit earlier, that gives us some opportunity to have discussion. There's a lot that goes on when we talk about Power BI Dataflows itself, and that's what we're here. That's what we're gathered to talk about. Now, if you've been with us in other previous Learn with the Nerds, here's a couple of things that you're familiar with, right? We're going to start here, and we're going to go till 2, as I mentioned. We as well are going to take a little bit of a break around that 12:20, 12:30 mark. It's just going to be a 15-minute break. Just kind of stop whenever it feels natural and organic. Now, yes, this is a live event. I've been seeing a lot of messages. Like, I'm looking down, I just saw something from David Lee. Hello from Sunshine, Florida. So, I mean, this is live. But naturally, as soon as we finish this event, as soon as it closes up, we are, of course, going to be putting this right up on our YouTube channel. So it's going to be there and available for you to follow up on. Now, this kind of segues into the next point, right? Questions, of course. There's lots of you in the chat, lots of you from so many different places. I saw a message in there saying it's going to be dinner because more than likely they're over the pond, they're overseas. So the chat's going to be active. It's going to be going. Really, this is something I have. Jeremiah's in the background. Got a couple people looking in the background. As they go through that chat, they'll try to answer any sort of questions that you might have. But as you can expect, with what we have to cover, with how many people are here in this call, we're not going to have that opportunity to just kind of stop and troubleshoot all those issues. But that's why we put it up there for recording. Now, as far as the materials and the items that we're going to be going through, we're going to be doing different URLs and online access. That's why in the file, there are no files, right? We're going to be in the Power BI Cloud Service, which is awesome because we can leverage and take advantage of basically various different URLs. I tried to make it as easy and user-friendly here. Some of the examples, basically only really one, is going to be done on my end that you probably won't be able to follow identically. But you'll be able to recreate that on your own, probably post the recording. And that's going to be when I connect to my Azure SQL database. Just because, I wanted to showcase something here with Dataflows, so that's what I'll be doing. But for the most part, in the first example, I'm going to connect. It's just going to be to our URL. I can provide that URL in the chat. Post-class, we'll have a link for the PDF download, and I'll make sure that there's a Word document in there, probably just a text file, which will have all the URLs that was used in today's class. So about following along, if you wanted to, certainly, but that's really not the focal point and idea of today. It's just about really giving you this information on what exactly is Power BI Dataflows. Now, this is some of the, original stuff. If you've been with any of our Learn with the Nerds in the past, this is pretty standard stuff here. If you haven't seen them, make sure you check it out. We have a whole playlist for those previous events. But on to a couple of new things. First and foremost, myself. You haven't seen me yet on Learn with the Nerds. Maybe you've seen me on some of the other YouTube, the Pragmatic Works YouTube videos, as well as possibly on our on-demand learning platform. But my name is Manuel Quintana. I'm a fellow trainer here at Pragmatic Works, and I love what I do, straight up. I'm pretty sure there's a couple familiar names in there I've either met, talked with, or maybe you've seen some of my videos, so it's great to see you guys coming back. Also, naturally, the topic, new, Power BI Dataflows. Now, that word Dataflows is always fun for me because there's so many different variations, right? If you're in the Power Apps platform, you have Dataflows there. If you're in Azure Data Factory, it's Dataflows there. It's a lot of different things, but we're going to refine this down. We're going to focus on Power BI Dataflows. That's the emphasis. That's what we're going to discuss. There's technically a little bit of, like spillover into Power Apps, like when you go on Dataflows there, but we won't be focusing on that. And last but not least, you may have already noticed, but we have a new couple options in that chat menu just to have a little fun. Super sticker, super chat, just another way to kind of get involved with the community. If you want to add a little support in there, that's just something we wanted to add into the chat. It's a little bit of fun, but just you guys being here, the support that you've given us over the many Learn with the Nerd events, it's amazing, guys. We appreciate it so much. We love that you come here, and from what we're seeing from the comments, the stuff that we're kind of introducing to you, the information we're sharing, it seems to be helpful, right? At the end of the day, that's our goal, is just to provide you guys information, insights, and hopefully you can bring it back to work and, be that superstar in your organization. Like, hey, guess what I learned about Dataflows today? So with all that fun stuff out of the way, let's see what else we've got here. For today, once again, we only have a PDF available for you. That's all it is. It's just a PDF of these slides, so you don't need to really jot down everything you see on the slide deck itself because you're going to have this PDF version. Once again, once this is put up as a recording, there'll be a link that will have that PDF, and I'll include, once again, a text document which will have the links that will be used today as we're doing this live. If you're going to attempt to kind of follow along and go through the process, of course, as we go through these stages, I'll make sure I'm explaining this, but we are going to be traversing over kind of various different areas when it comes to licensing in regards to data flows. That's a pretty big conversation here. How can I use data flows? What features are available to me? So naturally, we're going to be covering those topics as we go through it. It's in the slide deck as a reminder, so you'll be there. But many of the things that we're going to be looking at today will require either a premium per user license, or it will require a premium per capacity, so what's known as dedicated capacity. Now, data flows can be used for Pro, and we're going to discuss in what kind of constraints that you can use data flows if you have what's called a shared capacity, so your organization either has free or Pro licenses, you don't have premium per user or premium dedicated, you can still use it. So you're definitely going to have value regardless of what type of licensing you have going on, you can take advantage. Now also the nature of the demonstrations we're going to be doing today, just to make it nice, clean, and streamlined, will not require a data gateway, right? This is something that's used for Power BI, Power Apps, all the Power Platform in its entirety. Azure uses it as well. But if you're ever going to use data flows in conjunction with any sort of on-premises sources, on-prem SQL Server, maybe you have an Excel or CSV and a file path on your local network, that requires a data gateway. We won't be going through that today, but we have a ton of content on all the other technologies. Basically, it's the same usage as for Power BI, Power Apps. If you're going on-prem, you need that data gateway. We won't be using it for our examples today, but it should be known that is something that is required if you're going to be going that route with your sources. As far as the content, what we're going to be kind of going through and covering today, we're going to be looking just as a general overview of what's going on inside of data flows itself, of course, as you can see there. And then we're going to be moving on and going into talking about storage. So we won't be hopping right into creating data flows because there's actually some pretty important decisions that you can make prior to starting making your data flows. And this is actually very critical, right? The option to do this actually has to be defined before any data flows exist in your workspace. And technically, if you want to kind of eliminate this, you have to detach any data flows as well. So storage actually is an interesting conversation. I think sometimes gets missed out. And once again, it actually has to be a decision that you make when you create the workspace itself. Very, very important. So after we kind of talk about a little of storage, we're going to start creating data flows, right? I'm going to kind of use two different environments to show you guys this. The first environment we're going to have, I'm going to be logged into, doesn't have premium. It isn't a premium per user. It doesn't have dedicated capacity. It's just me as a pro user. So you can see, yes, in a workspace, I have access to data flows. I can see it. And I'm going to use that as an example to tie into Azure Data Lake Storage so you can see what that's all about and why you might want to consider using Azure Data Lake Storage instead of just the default storage, which we'll be discussing. Then I'll switch over to a tenant that has premium capacity, and this is where I'm going to go through the majority of the examples. That's why following along might be a little bit difficult because some of you may not have these options for using dedicated or premium capacity. So that is going to be some item that we kind of need to look at and to discuss. From that point, we're also going to go into just some integration. Really what we're talking about here is consuming. Right? I've created some data flows. How do I use them? What are the different options that I have to take advantage? The most obvious and natural one will be using Power BI Desktop, but as we go through some of the different options, you'll see there's other methods and ways, and depending on what we decided on that storage, it opens up even more. And last but not least, depending on how much time we have, we're going to take a look at AI Insights. We're definitely going to start it, but there's a couple of things, some go a bit deeper, but we're going to look into some of these AI Insight capabilities that exist within data flows. So hopefully that sounds exciting, and there's really only one more announcement, guys. He's not here in the chat right now. He'll probably be in later on, but if you know him on Twitter, if you have him on Facebook, let's make sure we wish Mr. Devin Knight a happy birthday, because it's today, guys. So wish him. Let's just assume he's the graceful age of 30. We'll give him that little name there. But yeah, Devin Knight, if you've been on any Learn with the Nerds, he's our commander-in-chief here in training. So let's wish him a happy birthday, guys. So, with no further ado, let's kind of dive in and begin the conversation around data flows. Now you're going to see me kind of popping in and out here just as I focus in the conversational pieces so I don't get too distracting, so you can really hone in on what's going on here. Now we're not going to spend too much time on these slides because you have it. This is at your disposal, right? You can kind of revisit these items and go into it and look at it at your disposal. We want to dive in and see how we get this working, right? So when we talk about Power BI, just Power BI as a whole, right? We know that this has come as a major wave, major popularity. Years ago, we have this kind of growth in what's known as the self-service BI, right? This is this wave that everyone's writing. It's more popular than ever. So Power BI has grown over these last 3 years immensely. And one of the areas, one of the gaps that we have when we talk about self-service business intelligence is really gaps in the data preparation process. Now, Power BI does have, for any of you who've worked with it or have leveraged it, the Power Query Editor, right? You go into Power BI, you hit Transform Data, boom, you got the Power Query Editor. In the background, this uses the M, or the mashup query language, an extremely flexible and dynamic language that allows us to create business rules within our data. But it's really not an enterprise-level ETL tool. Now, if ETL is a new term for you, that stands for extract, transform, and load. So it can do this, right? We bring data in, we can transform it, and technically we are, if we're importing, we're loading it into the Power BI model. So it kind of fits that idea, but it really isn't an enterprise tool. The more we start jamming into our Power BI reports inside the Power Query Editor, that naturally will have impacts in the overall efficiency of the model. And at the same time, if we're in a Power BI desktop report and we're doing creating all these business rules, that's me creating these business rules, setting that up. There's no real form of collaboration here. Because if I publish this out to the Power BI service, all we have is the data set and we have the actual reports itself. We can't access that backend. We can't access the Power Query Editor with the reports that are being launched into the service. This is really where Power BI Dataflows comes into play. Now, the greater extension of data capabilities, ML, AI, this has actually grown. We're seeing it now in Power BI Desktop. It's been here for a couple of months now, so they've actually started to add extensibility at the self-service, right at the desktop level. That is there too. But the whole purpose of this cloud environment, the whole purpose of that Power BI service is to have workspaces, so we can organize and work with our fellow colleagues, and we can have collaborative efforts here. So it's very popular right now that people will create Power BI datasets, right? They'll publish this out to the service and users will consume it. A very effective and awesome way to basically kind of have governance for your Power BI service. But at the same time, when we need to make adjustments or amendments to the data cleansing, the business rules that we created, we either have to download that report, get into Power BI Desktop and make those changes. The collaborative side, not that straightforward. This is where we have Power BI Dataflows coming into the mix here. It's pretty awesome, pretty amazing. So that's what it's meant to do. Fill in the gap. We have whatever sources we have data flows which connects to those sources, cleans those up, and then creates them effectively as data sets. And we're going to talk about what that looks like. In Power BI directly, we have a Power BI Dataflows connector, and that's it. You connect to it, you log in with the credentials that is the same credentials you use for the service, and you get to see whatever data flows you want, and you import that into your Power BI report, and off to the races you go. Writing reports, creating dashboards, all of that fun stuff. This becomes a consumable, a usable source like any other source inside of Power BI. But now, when we need to address and make some changes and update what's going on in that data set, we simply can go to the Power BI service, myself, any of my other colleagues, anybody who's in that workspace. We have all of that logic, all of those rules right there in the service that we can access, manage, maintain, we can refresh things. It's right there, and it does provide an end-to-end solution for basically that ETL process that we're looking for, which is pretty awesome and amazing. That's where Dataflows fits in. So at the end of the day, really a quick way, like what are data flows? It's effectively the Power Query Editor online. So if you're familiar with Power BI and you've used the Power Query Editor, you're going to be pretty familiar with the user interface you're going to see here during this call. It's pretty awesome, it's pretty neat, and we're going to check it out together. Now, who should be using this? Really in this range where we're seeing an extension of the responsibilities for the business analysts, for the, the kind of the you know, when we talk about data consumption and the responsibilities for like citizen development, it's becoming more and more widespread on these responsibilities, right? So we're seeing more and more usage. Now, quite often, this is going to be something that's managed and maintained by users inside of a workspace. So I think that naturally kind of dictates who's going to be leveraging this. Anybody who's already kind of in that space of report writing, report management, they're going to be the ones who are going to be in these workspaces already. So this isn't going to be extended out to any of the end user consumers, right? These are going to be those managers of those workspaces that have that data wrangler knowledge. Where does the data exist? How can we bring it in? The one aspect of Dataflows that should be understood is that it is focused on the data shaping side, right? It's the Power Query editor. So we don't touch on the modeling side, creating relationships and DAX and stuff like that. That is still relegated to the Power BI desktop itself. But really, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about more of those data wranglers here. But once again, more and more we're seeing these kind of roles and responsibilities of the analysts expanding. So more and more we're seeing this come into play. But the idea here is not to have a bunch of different Power BI data sets, not a bunch of individuals creating their own business rules. We create a data flow, which has, you know, these 3 tables that we know our users are going to have, and they have a standard set of logic, and everyone can access and use it that needs to. And if we need to adjust or amend or add logic to it, it's in one central location. Now here we see a fairly loaded topic, licensing strategy. Something that's missing in this representation is really just power premium per user. For the most part, power premium per user mimics what you can do with dedicated capacity, except for some of the performance increases. But you can leverage with power premium per user, so the PPU license, the new license that's out there, you effectively can leverage everything that the dedicated capacity can do, but some of the throughput is not as pronounced. You have more throughput when it comes to using dedicated capacity, but when we get into talking about linked entities and calculated entities and, you know, using the AI items, the AI insights and data flows, that is available to a premium per user as well. Like I said, a little bit newer. I think there's a bit of confusion in the air when it comes to what premium per user licenses can do. And they have restructured workspaces, and we're going to see that first and foremost, right? This is important. What type of modeling, what kind of licensing structure are we going to have, and what capabilities is that going to grant us when it comes to Dataflows itself? So that's what we're going to be discussing here, right? So just a little bit of conversation, a little bit of setup there in the overview, but the common data model is something that we're going to touch on very briefly. It's a much deeper conversation, a much deeper topic, but it should be known. When we create data flows, we effectively are going to be storing those data flows. We're creating something that has business rules. It's effectively creating a table, and we're loading data into it. So it's storing this. And just in case, of course, there naturally has been some verbiage changes here, where the common data model in regards to Microsoft is Dataverse and entities are tables, but still in the Power BI service, we actually still see the usage of the word entity still in play here. So it looks like it hasn't been translated in all avenues, but at the end of the day, that's what's happening by default. And we're going to get into this. When you create a data flow, you're storing it in some default Azure storage, and it is in what's called the common data model structure. It's just there, it's storing the metadata and the data itself. But by default, unless you tie it into your own type of storage, it's just stored in the background, something that's really not accessible, really only is accessible using the Power BI desktop, and also as well data flows in the service. It's kind of limited, and that's what we're going to talk about, bringing your own storage and what that opens up for you. But as a whole, the common data service, which is leveraged across the entire Power Platform, is based off the common data model, which is an open data initiative. IBM, Microsoft, SAP, a bunch of different organizations are part of this open data initiative to create a common set of objects, right? These common set of tables, common set of columns, so they can be proprietarily, like kind of, you can work across various different technologies. That's the idea behind it. So the Dataverse itself is Microsoft's flavor on the common data model. And at the end of the day, when we're storing data flows, it does it in that structure. That doesn't have a big play in what we're going to be talking about today, but it's going to come up, so I didn't want it to be some sort of strange topic. But when it comes to the common data model and the Dataverse, that as well, its own big, deep topic. Make sure you check out Jeremiah actually just did a brand new Intro to Dataverse class, an awesome one to check out also. Like you can see, this is just describing the schema, what it looks like. You have the model at the top, we have common apps, but this is meant to extend even beyond the Microsoft Power Platform. That's where the common data model is meant to be, part of that open data initiative. So we're not going to spend too much time on this. This is just meant to be a logical representation of what that model is meant to look like. And here's where it fits in the scope of Power BI. We have our sources. In the service, we have our data flows, which are connecting to data, cleaning up that data, and then when we store this data, we actually have kind of two avenues, either the standard default Power BI storage, or we bring our own, but at the same place, it's still all going to be using effectively Azure Data Lake storage on the back end. It creates its own structures, its own files, and I'll show you that. I actually have already created a workspace, connected it to my Azure Data Lake storage, created a quick data flow just so we can see what it's created, the structure of everything, and you can actually see that. Actually, I think I have it right here on, it's probably coming up in a slide or two. Let me not skip forward too fast, but we'll see that structure here in a moment. But that's how it's stored. Once again, if we use the default storage that Power BI offers us, it's really only accessible from the service and Power BI desktop. So right there, hopefully I'm accenting how cool it is if you bring your own data lake into the scenario. There are quite a bit of requirements when it comes to using Azure Data Lake itself if you want to leverage that piece. So to take advantage of this, there's a couple of requirements. Like I said, we're not going to go through each and every piece. We're not going to go through actually setting up that storage account and getting everything taken care of. I've put some of the core requirements here in this PDF so you have it available to you. But naturally, if you're going to be going this route, accessing and going into the Microsoft documentation will keep you online and keep you on course. So just a couple of the key things here, just a bullet point of, hey, in Azure, if you create a storage account, here are the minimum specs so that you can connect your Power BI workspace to Azure Data Lake storage. And now when you're creating these data flows, you have access to it. You can have access to this common data model structure, which has the metadata and all that. And what does that mean for us when we do it? That means now we have access to this to consume it in other Azure services. We literally have access to this data that's in a storage account, in an Azure Data Lake storage account. So we can take advantage of it in maybe Azure Machine Learning Services. We can tie into it and maybe do some stuff with Azure Data Factory. It's available to us. That's really a main thing we want to do so we can take advantage. Now, it should be noted, you can potentially tie specific workspaces to storage accounts, and there is an actual option at an organizational level to say, hey, here's the organizational storage account if we want to use that too. So there's kind of actually some different kind of tiers in which you can leverage this. But it's a really cool option. This is just a quick look at kind of the structure of how this information gets stored inside of that storage account itself. And like I said, I've already created a workspace. I've tied it to my storage accounts so you can see what that actually looks like. So let's actually take a gander. Let's dive in. Let's actually go into a little demonstration where we can look at, and this one is going to be a little more, if you want to follow along with the beginning, you can, but obviously I've already created a workspace, I've already created an Azure storage account, and I've connected that to the workspace that you're about to see. So let me go ahead and bring this up so we can take a look at it. So right here, we can see that I'm in my workspace, and what I'm actually going to do is let me bring this up as well here. All right, I had this up. I must have accidentally closed this out. Perfect. We want to be right here. One second to sneeze. All right, sneeze averted, so you're not deafened. But we can see I'm logged in. PowerBI.com. This is an account that does not have premium, right? To indicate premium, naturally, as you may or may not know, there's this little pretty diamond icon next to us. As you can see, there is no diamond icons. So I mentioned a couple of important decisions need to be made before you even start creating data flows. So let's look at what that looks like. When I go to create a workspace, right? And once again, you may not be able to do this. These are permissions that potentially could be turned off by your organization. They can limit who can create workspaces. So you might just be able to watch, but this is just a quick data flows demo. That's all I'm going to put. We're not even going to use this. But we can see as I'm going through this process, there are some choices that are critical under the advanced section. And this is where you must make these decisions, right? Now you can switch workspaces, basically the license mode. This is something you can adjust after you create it. But if you're going to be taking advantage of some of the premium capabilities, then you need to either be premium per user or premium per capacity. If you were unaware, they've made these adjustments before. You just kind of made a workspace and licenses are effectively associated with users. That's still the case. Licenses are associated with users, but now if you're a premium per user, you are the only type of license that can be in a premium per user workspace. premium per capacity, you could technically be both. It gets a little muddy here, but we don't want to focus into those details. But if you're going to take advantage of some of the premium related features, you must either have the premium per user or the premium per capacity. And I'll show you in a moment. In my scenario, this doesn't have premium, but I was still able to create a data flow and it worked. So that's the first step, is considering the license mode. But once again, it's not the end of the day if you choose Pro. If you happen to have premium per user, if you happen to have premium per capacity, you can make this change after creation, as you're going to see right here. If I go in and I locate this data flows that I created, you can see there is a data flow. This is a non-premium workspace. And if we look at the settings here, we can see that I potentially could make some adjustments if we had the licensing available to us. They actually would make that option available to me down below, right? You can go in here and make those adjustments. Well, here is the fun thing. Azure Connections, by default, this storage will just say attach or connect to Azure. That's all it will say here. By default, we are not connected to Azure. You will use the default Power BI storage here. But I've gone through and I have connected this, as you can see, to a storage account called Dataflow ADLS. And if we come over here, if I go and find this storage account, just so you can see just what it has done for us, right? And there was nothing in this. You can see it creates a backup because we actually save versions of our data flows in here. But if we go into Power BI itself, here's that name of that workspace, here is the name of that data flow, and you can see some snapshots of the data, some JSON. These are things, as we're going to see later on, we can bring into play, but this is also where we can go in and we can actually see the data and leverage it and access it and use it for other Azure services. So this would be one of the reasons why I'm bringing this up, is to talk about the defaults. It's great, it works, and if you know you're going to be using it just in the confines of the Power BI service, or if you're just going to be consuming things using the Dataflows connector in Power BI Desktop, then you can use the standard storage. There's no problems. Those work fantastic. But by opening this up and connecting your workspace, or, because there is an option at the very bottom when you set this up, you can either, when you choose to connect to Azure, you can connect to this workspace to a specific storage account, or specify a storage account that's been set at the tenant level of the Power BI tenant itself. So I've tied this workspace over to a storage account which I defined and I created, technically not like an organizational storage account. But because I've done this, as I add more and create more workspaces, or as I create more and more data flows, they're going to be stored here. The metadata of the data flow is going to be there, and we'll see how that can come into play later. The data itself is going to be in there, so now I can use it with various different Azure services. All we need to do is grant the appropriate access to this storage account. Here's another pretty cool thing. If I were to go through and delete all of these data flows that I've worked on, if something happens, we remove it, the data storage, the Azure storage account, it stays there. It doesn't auto-delete, it doesn't remove. You would have to explicitly remove those items. So it's great because it has it all in there, kind of like a redundancy element to us, which we can take advantage of. So this is the beginning. This is before you start to create data flows. You do need to define this. Once you have started creating data flows, the option to create an Azure connection actually is unavailable to you currently. So it will just use standard default Power BI storage in the background. And if you wanted to say, hey, you know what, now's the time, I do want to make a switch, I do want to connect this to my storage account, you would actually have to delete all of your data flows in the workspace, and then you can connect it. So a little bit icky. Now granted, there are ways that you can go ahead and export data flows. That's an option right there. So you could export them all, then delete them, and then import them later. Obviously, so you don't have to recreate things from scratch. But this is why I wanted to show you workspaces first, right? Now, as far as, and the one thing, of course, naturally is if you use the default storage, right? If you use that default storage that's coming from, the standard, if you don't connect it to Azure Connections, naturally there's no additional cost in there. When you bring your own storage, it's just about the cost of maintaining the actual storage account itself. So that is just, the storage cost for storage accounts varies. It does create hot storage, but honestly, the costs here are pretty minimal, pretty low. ADLS storage accounts, You can get and leverage additional features to increase that cost, but for the most part, the amount of data that's stored in there is pretty good, pretty effective as far as a cost analysis there. So it's definitely something you need to check into. That's a whole nother billing scenario, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention. And once again, if you're not going to be leveraging this information for other Azure services and other items, then you don't need to. You don't need to. And as well, we've talked about, you could make this decision at a later point in time. So that's just something I wanted to bring up into the mix. So that is Workspaces. This is decision number one. Now we can go ahead and we'll wave bye-bye to this workspace here. I'll probably just minimize it for the moment because we're going to be working over here, which as you can see, this is a premium account. Now do note, I have a couple of data flows already pre-created. I'll explain those when we get into it, but don't worry, we're going to create some items from scratch here momentarily. But we got to do a little level setting on what exactly we're going to be doing here. So that's where we come into creating data flows. Now the one thing I didn't mention, we had this whole conversation around workspaces and the licensing mode of the workspaces and that fun stuff. That brings us to the conversation of the My Workspace. Hopefully everyone's aware, every one of us here on the call, there's something called the My Workspace. The features there are limited. One of the features that is limited that you don't have available in your My Workspace is the ability to create data flows. So regardless, my data, the My Workspace should be treated like a dev area. You should never have anything production anyways. This is only going to be available for app workspaces. So you have to create a workspace and then make all those decisions we just decided. That is where you will have the ability of creating data flows themselves, right? Now we're going to see when we go and hit new data, or when we go to create a new data flow itself here momentarily, it's going to grant us, a lot of capabilities, right? You can see we go to get started. It's going to look, right? It's going to look like Power BI when you hit transform data, but doesn't have a 100% parity, as you're going to see in a moment, to what we have available to us inside of actually Power BI itself. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But here is the first screen. When we get to our workspace and we're like, let's go, we're ready. Let's go ahead and let's create a data flow. These are the current 4 options that will be presented to us. Now you rewind the clock a couple months ago, there wasn't the import model option, wasn't available. So who knows, these things could grow. You're gonna see a little bit behind the curtains here when I show you my environment. Kind of in the future glimpse, the environment we'll be using is, it kind of has access to beta features, so you won't see one feature that I have. We're not gonna go into it. I think from an NDA perspective as well, I can't really go into that item. But there's some exciting things on the roadmap. If anyone was there for the previous Microsoft where we had the Business Application Summit, then we had the most recent event which talked a lot about the Power Platform. Dataflows is going to get some performance boosts. We are going to be seeing something in the form of what's called streaming data flows, and I think this is going to add some pretty cool elements in this conversation. So there's no ETA on things like streaming data flows. Just keep an eye out. Like I said, you're going to see it on my screen. We're just not going to be able to go through it just because of the state of what that feature is at right now. But here, we hit new data flow. Got to make a choice. This is our first area where we discuss pricing. So our first item, the one that says define new tables. Just as you see here, this literally goes through and it tells us exactly what we need to handle here. You can either create your own custom entity or you can connect to a data source and map it to standard entities. Remember the term entities, it's still kind of being used here, but tables is the correct term. You'll see entities show up in other places, but this is tables. So I'm going to connect to a source. Do I want to put it in a new custom table, which will be stored in this common data model format? Or do I want to map the data that's coming from whatever sources I've decided to a standard table inside the Dataverse? So you actually do have that capability and those options to do that. This is available for all modeling types, all license structures, Pro, PPU, Premium Per User, Dedicated Capacity. You're going to be able to do this. Now there's a small nuance in here, right? There's this item called a computed table, or like I said, it's sometimes referred to as computed entity. This can be achieved when we're on the online designer, and those are actually premium only. So yes, you can go here, you can say add new table, it launches the web designer, and off to the races you go, whether you're pro or premium. And you can finish it up, you can refresh it, as long as computed tables or, as you see to the right of it, link tables are not in play. So this is the most common one that everyone here in this call will probably have access to and you'll be able to leverage, and they get the job done. Tell me what you want to connect to, bring it in, define the rules on how you want to clean it up, and then let's save that into either our storage or the default Power BI storage, right? So that one's open. Then we go over to link tables from Dataflows. Now link tables, those actually will be reference tables, right? There's some interesting things that we can accomplish when it comes to the linked tables here, but this, like the common areas or patterns that you might want to use for this is effectively going to be, like for instance, if you want to go ahead and reuse a table multiple times, right? That is a great scenario where you can go through and you can use what's called a linked table so that you can have it in one location and you effectively reference it in other data flows. So you can mitigate or streamline kind of the redundancy of refreshing a table that's hitting the same source. This happens a lot. When we use multiple Power BI datasets that are pointing to the same tables, this is a very common practice, right? You'll go in, you'll have multiple datasets, you'll refresh them, well, they're probably hitting the same source. Here's a great scenario where if you have like a static lookup table or like a date table, something that is very common that could be used in multiple data flows, instead of connecting and bringing it in every time, you can reference a data flow, another data flow that exists inside of your actual. It has to be inside the same workspace, but you can do that. Link tables, as you can see, as noted, premium. Next to that, which the colors are a little mismatched there, it's the yellow one, the import CDM format data flow is the third item that says import model. This one is going to be available for all licensing structures. This literally just, when you hit it, it opens up a file browser and you are prompted to load in the file type it's looking for is a JSON. So I showed you earlier how you could export a data flow. This puts it in what's called a JSON format type. That's how the common data model format is stored. So you can export and then you can import. This is a very nice, easy way that you can move data flows from one workspace possibly to another workspace if you wanted to. So a pretty standard feature. Interesting enough, that's the newest one that's come to the table, but you know, it's there. So the other item, of course, is going to be if we have the fourth option, which is premium only. We can see it's attach a common data model folder. This relates to, once again, the Azure Data Lake, right? If we're using advantage of our own storage, it's going to be storing it in the common data model structure, and you technically can attach a Data Lake Storage Gen 2 account to this, and we will import whatever's in there. All that structure, all that data. It's another way of doing import model, but it's taking advantage of the potential Azure Data Lake storage that you may have already set up. Right? And it should be noted, right? You can have as many data flows in a workspace that you want. Honestly, when we create a data flow, within a data flow also, you can have as many tables or queries in there as you want. So kind of the sky's the limit when it comes to that kind of realm and those types of items. Now, once we've decided what we want, let's assume we're going to hit that first option one, right? The one that lets everybody use it, creating a new table. We're going to see that this is the UI, and this is where the nostalgia comes into play. This is where the familiar UI comes into play. Now, you might notice, though, we have 49 options available to us right here in the user interface. This is the Power Query Editor. This is just like Power BI. Or if you've been using Tabular Analysis Services 2017 or higher, this is the same UI as well. But if you think about it, if you've ever been to like one of our Power BI classes, we always say there's over 80 connectors in Power BI. And it's true. There are actually more connectors in the Power Query Editor, which is available in the Power BI desktop, than there is here. But the interesting thing, this is continuing to grow. We're going to continue to have more sources added in here. There's some much more natural integration with cloud services since this is already in the cloud. But interesting enough, I've seen it. I haven't done it personally myself on many examples, but I've seen many a blog that actually says, hey, you know what? If you don't see the source that you're looking for in Power Query Editor online when you're creating a data flow, you can do it inside of Power BI Desktop and just copy the M code out of there, and you could just paste it in here. It's pretty interesting. I would definitely describe that as a workaround, so it's not going to work in all scenarios, but it's just something that I ran across when I was doing some examples that technically you can access that Power BI Desktop and kind of move that code from one place to another, which is pretty cool that you can do it. But I think organically, over time, we're going to see that kind of 100% parity from what you're expecting in Power BI Desktop to what we have over here inside of the Power Query Editor online. Right? And that's, once again, that official kind of name here. Now for us, we're going to connect and we're going to point to a source and we're going to bring that right on in, and we're just going to create this, right? We're going to create a new table. But once again, remember, in the background, this is all touching what's called the common data model. So something that you will find here that's unique to the Power Query Editor Online that you won't find in Power BI Desktop is this option, this map to standard. And what it's saying is here, do you want to basically take your sources and instead of creating brand new tables, simply map those columns, map your source tables to some existent tables that are part of the default common data model. There's a bunch of different tables that are already created. You know, you have your accounts, you have your events, you have your customers. Like there's these very standard tables that exist. They have many, many columns. It could be a potential route that you would leverage here, right? So it is something unique to the Power Query Editor, but nothing too crazy. Now let's go over and start by creating our first data flow itself. Now, once again, in my scenario, if you wanted to, all you'd need to have is a workspace of any type for this first example. You know, it doesn't have to be premium. In my case, I do have one. I'm going to switch over to it. Actually, it's right here. This is the exact one I want. And we're going to be connecting to a source here. So let me go ahead and get this to you guys right now. Some of you might be familiar with this. Bring this up right here. All right. It's going to be this guy right here. All right. And I'll put that temporarily in the chat. Just look for that Pragmatic Works sign there. Let me actually post this here. You might have to repost this for me. And specifically, I'm going to actually use a URL. Now, if you're not familiar with this, obviously this is a web page, right? But there's some fun things you can do with this. This is an example we use with Power BI Desktop, but I can go right here on this download link and I can copy this link address, which is pretty fun and pretty cool. So I can use this directly inside of what I'm about to do next. So I'll kind of leave that in the background in case we need to revisit. But I've got my connection. I've got my source that we want to use. What this is just effectively it's a CSV that's hosted online, which provides us a list of failed banks from the year, I think it's 2000 to 2020. We use this in other examples, but it's perfect because it's a web. You guys it's an anonymous open URL. Everyone should have the potential to connect to this. Now, we do need to make sure that our next decision, right? We're in our workspace. Whether it's Pro, Premium, or Premium per capacity, we can go right here. I'm just right here at the main level, right? I haven't gone anywhere special. There's a couple ways you can actually technically access this, but I can just click the workspace name, and right here in the upper left is where you basically have access to create, every object that's available to us. Reports, dashboards, all this fun stuff. There's some interesting things. Like I said, some of these options you may not see. This is something that is leveraging some kind of roadmap items. You'll see streaming data flows. That's coming. It's going to be pretty cool. But right here, we can see we have data flows, right? And it tells us prep, clean, and transform data. And as soon as we go ahead and we click this, let's see here. The URL itself won't actually do anything. It'll just download a CSV just in case. All we need to do is we need to put it in for the data flow itself. So when I click data flow, we get those 4 options that we saw. Let me kind of close this out so we have more room. But there's our 4 choices, right, that we spoke about. Define new table, link new tables, and we're just going to go and start on the left-hand side and say, I want to add a new table. All right. When we click on this link, it gives us all of these choices that we can use. Excel workbooks, and you can go here and go File, Database. There's various ways to filter and manage this. What we're actually interested in here is going to be under the File option. You might think it's web. When we usually do this example, we actually use a web connector. But in this case, we're actually going to use the text CSV because the link that I've actually provided actually points directly to a CSV file itself. Right, we'll see it right here. I can paste that in. And we can see it points directly to a CSV. So although this is a file path, you can see you can provide a URL. This is going to basically collect that information from the CSV and preview that data right for us. So if I go ahead and hit next, it's going to connect to this location. and we're going to get a small preview, and we're going to get more nostalgia here. For anyone who's working with Power BI, this is the same kind of preview screen you would see, and it's just letting us know. Basically, if we need to make any adjustments, it's kind of figured out that this data uses a comma delimiter, and file origin. You can make adjustments here if you so choose, but it is previewing the data, so it's kind of just figuring this out for us. So I don't really need to make any adjustments. We'll notice coming from the web, it's kind of picked up an interesting character here at the end. That's actually a character. That's not some sort of like reserved symbol or anything like that. But we can go ahead now and hit transform data. Because remember, before with like Power BI, if you went into something like that, you actually had this capability, and I'm going to close this down on the left so we have more space here. You could like load it. Remember, at this point, we're creating a new table here. So we literally have what's called the Power Creator. Now let me kind of shrink this down so we can kind of take in this UI, right? On the left-hand side, since we're connecting right now technically to just one table, it's one CSV, we can see that it's brought that in and it's given us the name of query, right? That's the kind of the default item. As we start to tinker with different sources, as let's say we connect to something like SQL Server and we want to bring in 5 different tables, you're going to see all 5 tables there on the left. So it's very important to kind of label your things correctly here, label your tables correctly. So if you're collaborating with other users, they very much know where they want to go. So that's usually my first little step there. Let me go ahead and change the name here to failed banks, right? Just going to name my table accordingly. You can see that updates on the left. And whatever we have chosen on the left dictates what we see right here in the middle. So if I have multiple tables, as I make a choice, the preview will be displayed right here. And one of the most important pieces of the puzzle here is going to be on the right-hand side. In the query settings, we have the supplied steps. I also always say this when we're talking about Power BI Desktop, but this is going to be our steps. These are our breadcrumbs. These are the trail of what has occurred, what's happened to our table. These are all of our steps. Now, we haven't done anything, and you'll notice there's 3 already there. Now, there are some interesting icons located here. We will discuss and talk about this later. You see it says this step will be evaluated outside the data source. In a moment when I connect to SQL Server, this will be a bit different. All right. So we have this set. It's gone ahead and changed the column. I'm going to go ahead and fix this. You see this little question mark? Like I said, it's just an extra character. So I can actually click in the cell and delete it. And you'll see now it's added a step called rename columns. You can always either remove a step, go back in time. I can return. You can see I can click at different stages and look, how did this data look at that point in time? This is your breadcrumb trail, critical, and it's how we keep track of everything. So I'm actually going to go through here and modify and get rid of these little extra special characters that we have here. We don't need those. That's all I'm doing for this first little guy, so we can clean that up. Let me move to the right here. Get rid of this. We don't need that. And I believe there's only one left at the very end here for our closing date. And you can see that present and available. The last one, I believe, does not have it. I'll make sure. Fund is okay. So you can see rename column is there, and just in case, once again, this is like a code generator. We're not going to dive into M and how this works, but just know everything we're doing here is being translated into the mashup query language. That's what this little formula bar is at the top. That's what it's showcasing. You can, they always have it on there, which I appreciate, and it's good. We're not going to focus on it, but do note there's code being written, but we can rely on the UI. That's what makes this so successful. Now, for the most part, we can pretty much do a ton of different options. We can do a ton of different options in here, right? And most of it is going to be readily available to us. We can make, you see, choose columns, removing columns, split columns. All of these items are available to us. There are a couple of things, though, that do move into the realm of what's called a calculated table. And we'll look at that here in the next example. But let's say I want to remove some columns. Just like you would in, let's say, like Power BI or something of that nature, here's choose columns, and I can say, you know what? I don't need to use cert or I don't need to use fund. These are columns I don't think I'm going to need, so I eliminate them. Just by making that very quick decision, you can see on the right-hand side, it says choose columns. That's the step, and fund and cert are now gone. But the fun part is, too, if you're like, wait, what did I get rid of? What did I do? you can always hit the little cog over here and it brings you right back up to what was done, and you can modify that step in line. So there are some cool options we can do. We can manipulate and we can revisit what we've done, but we can add other steps too. Now we're not going to go wild and crazy here with the transformations, but you can do things. One of my favorite things to do here is if we want to enrich this, if we want to extend this and add more items, you can of course add columns, right? There's a lot of options here in the add columns. So what we can do is we can actually go ahead, let's say I can say, you know what, I see closing date is right here. I want to get a column that gives me my year, right? This is down to the day level, but I'd also like to go ahead and I'm going to right click this and hit add column from examples. And I can say, I would like the year 2020. Basically what it's doing is it's looking at the row and the columns that I have highlighted. So for this first record, I know if I look at the date here, it is October 23rd, 2020. So from add column from examples, it's saying, give me an example. Power BI service is saying, give me an example of what you would like based off of the data in this record, and we'll try to figure out what that pattern is. So when I give it 2020, it realizes that we want to extract the year from this column. I said, we're not going to focus on M and the code language itself, but you can also very easily visibly validate this. Look at this. For the first row, 2020, second, 2020. When we get to 2019, 17, it's figuring this out. So by me just typing in 2020, boom, I've created a new column that extracts the year from a specific item, and it's actually already relabeled this. And we can see there is our little step on the right-hand side. It's applying that, and now I have a table. I got rid of 2 columns, but now I've added a third. So manipulating this, adding these items, very easy to accomplish. But I'm going to show you something later. Like we said, you can see we have map to entity. That's there. We're not going to dive into that, but it literally brings up a list of tables that are available. There's a ton of tables in here, guys. So if you want, you can acquaint yourself with the common data model, but you could map things. But once you're there, once you're set and you've cleaned this up, you're like, perfect. You know, this is what my users are going to want. This is what they're going to need. That when they connect to it, they're going to see the table name is called failed banks, and they're going to have access to these 6 columns. They'll never see cert. They'll never see fund, right? We got rid of those. They are going to get year because we added it. And there really is a lot of things we can do here. I mean, explore and look at that transform ribbon. We can do a ton of capabilities. But in the very next example, I'm going to showcase something to you where it's going to use a linked table. And as part of that linked table, I'm also going to show some additional logic which shows us what a calculated table is. And I think I saw quickly in the chat there was something around combining data. Really, when we start to combine data, so when we start doing merge operations, when we do appendings, that can affect it. When we do, in our case, I'm going to create a reference table and then do a group by on it. These create calculated tables, and there's a special symbol that'll showcase. It'll be visible on the tables on the left, and it'll have a little lightning bolt. This will let us know it's a calculated table. This is where we start moving into the realm where you need to have either premium per user or premium per capacity. But right now, no lightning bolt, nothing set. I can go ahead and actually save and close this. This is now storing this in this tenant, in this environment. I have not tied this to Azure Data Lake storage. So this actually is storing it into the default Power BI storage. But I can give it whatever kind of data flow name I would like. So we can say our first data flow, something of that nature. You could add a description, information about failed FDIC failed banks, right? Just something that's more informative for the users. And then it's now present and available. And we'll see in a moment how this showcases itself to us. And we see right away it's asking, do we want to refresh now? You can, of course, do manual refreshes. This does not require a data gateway. So I can just let that happen in the background because we're going to want to see this data when we consume it. But now if we go and revisit the UI, right? If I go back and look, this is what we see. Here is our first data flow, okay? You have a bunch of options. You could manually refresh this. You can go ahead and schedule a refresh. We'll look at that momentarily. This is where there's other options where you can delete, edit, export. But you can actually, you know where we see edit? If you just click on the data flow, we get back to that view that we just saw. I'm in the data flow, and now I can see all the tables that are part of that data flow. right? So that is how we can go into it. And if I say, you know what, I actually need to update this. I made some sort of, I want to make a new column, or maybe I want to bring back a column. You can always hit this option right here where you can hit edit table. And this brings us back into that Power Query Editor right where we left off. And we can update, adjust, amend, delete, add things as we see fit. So you always have this capability. This is what we meant by having this centralized logic that's available to us within a workspace itself, right? So it's out here. Whoever I invite to this workspace, they're going to see these data flows and they can take advantage and potentially update and amend and adjust and any of those sorts of items. So that's a pretty important piece of the puzzle. What we can do as well is, now that we have, right, created our first data flow, we have other things. We talked about the linked table. So you'll notice in this case, I pre-created a date dimension. This could be anything in any source for any of you guys, right? I just created this in a very simple fashion using a blank query, but let's imagine this is a table that's coming from a SQL Server. Now, we can't go into all the nuances of why you would use a date table, what's the purpose of it. This goes much deeper into modeling, but a date table when we talk about things like modeling and DAX, it's a pretty impactful topic here. So you generally want to have a date dimension in your Power BI models if you're going to do anything with time intelligence, right? So I have this table. This is a common thing that would exist across various data sets that we would use in various different reports. Nothing really changed. It's the same table over and over. So I've gone ahead, I've connected to wherever that lives, SQL, Oracle, maybe I'm pulling it from an Excel spreadsheet in OneDrive, whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter. It's connecting to a source. Well, rather than creating new data flows and connecting to that source and having a different data flow and connecting to that source, every time we schedule a refresh, we're hitting that source over and over, right? Well, I have it here. And what I can do is I can create a data flow which is based off of a linked table. But once again, linked tables is where we start moving into you must be premium per user or you must be premium per dedicated capacity. And you'll see it kind of lets us know how do we do the refresh. So this scenario, I'm actually going to go through the process and I'm going to go ahead and create a new data flow. This one you definitely won't be able to follow along because I'm just going to show you, I want to tie in another piece of this puzzle. So there's a small cool little thing I can show you. But I'm going to tie this into a Azure SQL Server. So I'm going to create a new data flow, which is going to start with a linked table, this date dimension, and I'm going to bring in additional data from SQL. And we're going to see how it represents itself, how it shows in data flows, and really what we want to be kind of like, how do we refresh this, right? That's going to be kind of one of the elements. So as we just did, we start the same. We go here to new. We can make our way down to data flow, and we get the classic 4 little choices. This time around, though, we can hit linked tables, right? And when we do this, we're presented with basically how we want to connect to our Power BI data flows. I think I'm already connected, but just in case, let me make sure. Let me connect using my credentials here. Okay, looks like I already am. Perfect. This is designed in this manner to allow for what's called multi-tenant authorization. Like you could technically connect to a different account which is connected to a different organization, which is kind of neat. But once I'm connected to the appropriate account, which I have access to the appropriate tenant, I literally get a list of effectively all of my workspaces that have data flows. So in my case, we know on this one that I have here, we have the new FDIC one, our first data flow. That's the one we just made. And you can see when I expand it, I can choose which table I want to use from it. Now, this isn't actually the one we want to use, but if I go over here to the date dimension, the one I created ahead of time, here is this table. And I can check on it and say, this is where I want to start. I want to pull this table. I want to reference this table, which is in a different data flow. And I can go in right into the same normal Power Query Editor online, but you'll see it tells us linked tables can't be modified. This is going to be from a read-only perspective. Any changes that are done to this table aren't going to be saved. It actually just removes them. And we're going to see when we finish creating this data flow, it actually says, basically, if you want to refresh this, you need to go to this data flow, which has this original file, right? This is just a linked table. And you can see it's got that nice little icon. That's what represents a linked table. And you can see a nice tooltip that tells you exactly what's going on, right? Maintain consistency across your organization. Everybody wants to create some new reports. They want to use and do time intelligence with DAX. Well, let's make sure that everybody's using the same date dimension. That table's been set up already for, all of our fiscal details, all our fiscal information. It's already there. It's already in play. So that's what we can kind of design and set here. So that's taken care of. Now it's all about, let's bring in some more data, because this is something that I want to showcase as well. We mentioned these little icons here, and it says this step will be evaluated outside the data source. What does that mean? Obviously there's an icon here. What other icons can be present? Well, let me go ahead and make a quick connection here. I'm going to go ahead and connect to, this should be my Azure. I said this one you just kind of want to watch and see. I have a little friend visiting me here. All right. Okay. And we're going to see I'm just connecting to this database because I want to show I'm combining this data with a linked table. Any moment here. When we have those live demonstrations, you're waiting on there. Let's hopefully it behaves itself and lets me go in. Because what we're going to showcase here is that icon, and some of you who've been working with Power BI recognize and know this, but this is something that's pretty cool from an efficiency perspective. And it's going to be something called folding. All right? So I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to grab a couple of tables. I'm going to go ahead and grab dim customer. I'm going to grab dim product. Just a couple of items here for me to tinker with. And I'm going to hit create. So this is going to bring these three tables into this data flow alongside of my link table. And you'll see it's going to, the link table has its own little icon. And these ones are just making that connection to the Azure SQL DB. It's going a little bit slower than I would like, but it's okay. We'll give it a moment so we can see exactly what's going on here on the right-hand side. So maybe. It's thinking about it. Okay, there it goes. Notice the icon that you have right there on the right-hand side. See how it's green? Even though it's loading, once it kind of finishes here, there's going to be a different indication here. Pardon the delay, pardon the wait. While I'm looking, I just happened to see Alberto wrote that he's in his My Workspace and he doesn't see the ability of creating data flows. Once again, as a reminder, in the My Workspace, data flows is unavailable. You can only create data flows inside of an app workspace. So you need to create either a Pro, a Premium per user, or a Premium per capacity workspace. These are the only workspaces that allow that creation. And sorry guys, it's taking a little bit longer to load this up. This is, how it goes when you do a live demonstration like that. There we go. I just had to click off that other tab. So you can see it says this step will be evaluated by the data source. Okay? If I go ahead and I move over, there's some additional columns here. This is due to the nature of the relational database that I'm connecting to because there's been established relationships. It's kind of neat. It's like allowing me to do lookups. But let me just decide, I don't want these columns. So I select them and I remove it. We know that another step gets added here on the right-hand side. And we're going to see that it continues with this little green icon with this little lightning bolt. This is actually something called folding. And here's the great part, right? All those icons, you can go in here and you can look at the official documentation. This is basically making it so whatever steps I'm deciding to do here, it's actually pushing this over to the actual, and I can put this quickly in the chat here for you guys. Give me 1 second. This is just official documentation, right? But you can see here it talks about usage. Whenever we see that lightning bolt, whatever steps, whatever business logic that we're employing here, it actually goes to the source system. This is awesome from a performance perspective. The request gets sent. It's actually Azure SQL database itself, which is actually going to manage and maintain this process that, and then we only bring over those items that we find to be necessary. So that is going to be an awesome thing for us from a performance perspective. Now, there are some nuances when it comes to folding here. Only certain sources support it. In this last example where we did the failed banks example, that was basically going to a CSV hosted on a website. So naturally, there's no like native query language, right? There's nothing that we can like translate our M to in order to push the workload to the website. That source isn't capable of handling this. So for relational databases such as that, like Oracle, SQL, any of these sources, they'll have this capability so that you can leverage folding. The idea is the work that I'm doing in the Power Query Editor online, can that be translated to whatever the native query language is? So since I'm using Azure SQL Database, what we're talking about here is SQL. So this is all translated and done in the background for us using what's called folding. And you know folding's going on when you see that little green database icon with that lightning bolt. The key important thing to remember and recognize though is if we decide to go through the process and create or do some sort of logic in here which is not supported, that cannot be translated, the folding will end. As an example, what I could do is something like this, right? If I go over to something like the first name, there's a lot of options the Power Creator offers us. One of those options I can actually do is if I go to, I didn't mean to do that one. Here's the best part. I can just hit cancel. If I go over here, there's a transformation option that says I want to go ahead and, actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and do a capitalize each word. Let's see here. Capitalize each word isn't something that's available to us within SQL. So when I do this step, once it's finished processing, let's take a look at how this presents itself in this, the custom entity, the steps on the right-hand side. We'll give it a moment here. It's kind of loading up. But from a folding perspective, we're going to see that there's going to be some kind of nuances to this. It's kind of going. You can see we're still thinking about it. Notice the change in the icon. It says this step will be evaluated outside the data source. So now this is actually being processed here. On the Power BI service itself, like I said, a lot of the steps, a lot of sources that you use are going to be using this. It's capable of handling this, and it's capable of handling this in a performant way. But if we can push work out to the source side, that is going to be fantastic. So when working in the realm with sources that support this, right? Once again, this is called folding. Pretty much anything that's a relational database will support this. You kind of want to stick and do any sort of rules, do any sort of logic that you know your source system can handle, right? So capitalize each word doesn't work. Removing columns, that's just adjusting like a select statement. If I want to filter this down, that's using a where clause. But it will visibly showcase to you, am I folding or am I not? And as soon as you introduce, it's kind of like a chain that has to be unbroken. As soon as you introduce some sort of transformation that doesn't allow folding to occur, you can't do any more folding. So you kind of want to make sure you layer anything that can help you from that perspective first and foremost. Now let's say, just before we go on our little break here, I talked about right now we're already kind of in a space where this requires premium per user or premium. We're using a linked table in here. That's what dim date started as, right? If we wanted to, and let me go ahead and make sure that old products is all cleaned up here because it's kind of giving me a warning about it. So give me one. I'm going to clean that up there. Since you guys don't have access to this, I want to make sure it's taken care of. There's actually a photo image here too that we don't want that. But while we're here, let's assume here we have our customer table, right? We also have a table here that basically records a bunch of transactions. That's what's happening here. Well, let's say I want to create an enriched version of the customer table. All right? I would like to have a table that effectively, I want my customer table to have a new column and it tells me how many transactions each customer is attributed with. Now granted, of course, we could just bring this data into Power BI, and this is something we could easily do with just visualizations. But from a data perspective, from a transformational perspective, I want to just enrich my customer table. I want to do and figure out some grouping. So what I could do potentially is I can go and use our internet sales table, which once again, it's a transaction. All of these represent transactions, and we have a bunch of details. Who bought it, where did it get purchased, what got bought, when did it get purchased, just a bunch of stuff, right? And I'm just going to do a little bit of cleanup here at the end to remove these. Once again, these are just record data types. We're not going to need these here. Get rid of those. And since this represents this, what I could do is, if I group this table by my customer ID, and I group on it, and I get a count, this will give me customer ID, how many transactions, customer ID. Now granted, it's going to be in a new table, but then I can combine this with dim customer and make a new enriched customer table. There's many different scenarios where you're going to want to do this kind of logic, where you're going to be combining data, but this is where we're going to see an introduction of our calculated tables. Once again, this is a feature that is only available for premium per user or premium dedicated capacity. So let's say this, right? I've got internet sales. We know what we're going to do. I want to group by the customer ID here, and we want to do a count, right? I want to do a count grouped by customer ID. So to achieve this, I'm going to go ahead and choose my internet sales table because I like the details of it. I don't want to modify or transform this. I'm going to go ahead and create a reference table. Just by doing that, check out the symbol next to this table. There's little lightning bolts, right? Whether we duplicate, whether we reference, when you start to merge things, this is going to come about. So this right here introduces a calculated table. And this is only available for premium per user or pro, or premium per user or premium per capacity. So very easy to kind of step into this realm when we start to adjust this. Now the purpose of this table, of course, is to give us our number of transactions, right? That's what I want this table to do. And I'll just simply do a group by. Right? Over here in the transform, we can see there's a group by. It simply pops up, what do you want to group by? And I'm going to say I want to do it by my customer key, and I simply want to do a count of the rows. I do this. It's already a calculated table. This would be something that would adjust it, and you can see there's my customer ID, and how many transactions. Obviously, this isn't valuable yet, right? It's just an ID. It's our customer table. Right? It's this table right here that has the name, the email address, all the good info. So we need to now combine our new calculated table with this one to get a better, more enriched customer table. And that can be found in the home ribbon under Combine Data. We can simply hit Merge. And that's what we want to do here, right? We can go ahead and merge our customer table. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a merge as new. I'm going to create a brand new query, and we're going to call this enriched customer data. But I'm going to combine the data from customer, right? I'm going to combine it with my new number of transactions, and we're going to do this on the customer key. And we can see it's presenting to us, you know, how we're going to set this up. My UI is a little bit zoomed in, so we also have this option of what kind of join do we want to do. There's definitely a lot of nuances when it comes to joins. So definitely something, if you're unfamiliar with joins, this is something you want to check into. This does have an impact. There's obviously these are options. There's not like a right choice, like do this every time. It depends on your behavior of what you want to achieve. In my case, I'm going to leave this to a left join, which effectively says I want to keep every record in my customer table. I have 18,484 customers. That's how many rows I have in my customer table. I don't want to lose any of that. And I'm going to bring back only the matching records, which come from my, in this case, it's my kind of tailored down, my grouped by version of the fact table, the internet sales table. So I'm going to bring that over because there's a chance, right? There's a chance that there are customers who haven't made any purchases. They have 0 transactions. So they're not going to exist in this table here below. So even if they don't have transactions, I don't want to get rid of them. So that's where the joins come into play. Definitely examine and go further. That was a quick description of what a left outer join does. But as you can see, there's many other choices. So definitely look into those options. So I'm going to go ahead and make my join, and we end up with a new table, which is effectively just my customer table with another column, my number of transactions. So this would be my enriched customer table, we'll say, something like that. Just something to kind of describe what's going on here. So when my users go to pick what tables they want to use, we have access to it. And like I said, it's the customer table. If we compare them, they would be exactly the same, but instead, I have this option here, which allows me to, if I expand this, include my counts, right? And I'll rename this. We don't need the customer key from the merge. We already have it. And we'll rename it, instead of count, of course, we'll say number of transactions, something of that nature, right? Something that makes a little more sense. Number of transactions. So now it's there. It's built in. We just have an additional piece of details in this dimensional table, something that my users can take advantage of. Maybe they're not as savvy or as versed with Power Query Editor. They don't know as much in DAX, so they might not realize how they can come up with this. I can provide it to them right here. But like I said, this would be, if I wanted to do this in Power BI, there's actually a ton of ways we could accomplish this already. But now I have a table that has some additional facts, additional details, some additional attributes that I think my users would benefit from. And we can go ahead and close this out, right? Now I have a new data flow, so it's going to ask me to name this. We'll call this our sales information data flow. We've got, sales and enriched customers and our products. So that's what I'll go ahead and call this. But now we have another data flow inside of this workspace. This one, though, is using a linked table and it has a calculated table. So two elements which require, once again, premium per user or premium per capacity, right? So it's important to understand this, and you can see actually the nature of actually being able to leverage a calculated table. It's not too far off. It's very easy to kind of go venture into this realm where you're already using a calculated table. So you can see this is my data flow. You can see all the tables behind it. We're going to call this our sales information data flow, just like this. Now, when you rewatch this, as you go through this example again, this is for anything. I decided to use an Azure SQL database to showcase to you folding. The key piece of understanding here is any table that exists in any data flow can be used as a linked table. So you can reuse tables in new data flows. And as you can see, it tells me this is a linked table. It can be viewed and edited in the source data flow. And it's a little, let me see if I expand this. It's a little bit, I think it's because of my resolution, you can't really tell it, but it tells me the exact path. Data flows, it gives me the name of the workspace, the name of the actual data flow, and then the name of the table. So it's telling me exactly where to go if I want to make updates and changes to it. And you can see there's no ability for me to do an auto machine learning model. I can't do an incremental refresh. If I want to do that kind of stuff, I got to go back to my list of data flows. I got to find my date dimension, which this is the same one, and I can set up those refreshes here. But the best part is I set this refresh up here everywhere in every data flow that's leveraging this linked table. They all get refreshed all in one go. So standardizing this logic across all of your data flows. That's the idea behind a linked table and how we can take advantage and use it. But do be aware and remember kind of the licensing structure. We're now in that premium per user. We're in that premium per capacity space. So we've got these two items. Let's talk about something. We have been just seeing the manual refresh. Let's take a quick glance and look at what potentially scheduled refreshes would be all about. So let me go here and bring this up. It's actually very, very straightforward. As you saw, refresh now, it's there. But obviously, one important discussion needs to be had here is if you are using on-premises sources. Let's not forget the conversation that we visited earlier in the class when we were talking about kind of what you might need. If your sources are being brought in or are provided from an on-premises source, right? If it's not native, cloud native, data gateway comes into play. So that will be one of the kind of prerequisites for setting up a scheduled refresh, okay? Now, scheduled refresh and actually manual refreshes, we've seen it being popped up. That can naturally happen whether you're a pro user or whether you're any of the premium license users as well, as long as naturally the data flow in question fits within those criteria, right? You're creating a new data flow that doesn't use calculated tables or linked tables because you're only using pro. Yes, you can manually refresh that and you can schedule it, which we're going to see in a moment, very, very easily. The incremental refresh option, which is present, is only available, once again, for premium or premium for user. Now this works for the reasoning and the logic behind incremental refresh. If you're unfamiliar with that type of loading data pattern, it's not exclusive to Dataflows. This is something that's been around for a while, just loading data, is that you will effectively create some, you have to map and define some predetermined date columns so that you will specify, hey, I only want to refresh items within the X amount of time. So you specify the length of time, and then you go ahead and you specify a date to recognize if it falls within that threshold, that criteria. So instead of refreshing the entire data set, which is what happens when you use a manual refresh or a standard schedule, it literally just refreshes the entire data set. Imagine removing all the data and then reloading it all in. So as you get larger and larger tables, this will take more and more time. The idea with incremental refresh is that you can reduce that, but it should be known that when you do an incremental refresh the first time, we of course have to load all the data in. So you have an initial load, which won't save you any time, it'll be the same as everything else, but after that, whenever we schedule this incremental refresh, it's only going to update records that fall within whatever threshold we define. And we'll take a quick look at that user interface so you can see it. But once again, we are falling into that premium realm here. But refreshing, if you've done anything with Power BI, literally mimics the exact same user interface. You toggle it on, specify what the cadence is, the frequency is, and those time frames. Let's not forget though, we do have some limitations on the number of refreshes that we can do per day. This also relates to what kind of licensing. If we have what's called a shared capacity, which is just going to be pro and free, that's going to be 8 refreshes per data flow per day. So 8, I have 7 data flows. Each one of those can be refreshed 8 times per day. If I have premium per user or premium per dedicated capacity, that can be refreshed up to 48 times per day. And if that number seems a little bit weird, it'll make sense here in just one moment. So let's go right back to where I was, right? We have a couple of data flows here. We've seen already, there is our refresh. Here is our schedule refresh. If we were to access the very one that we just went to, which is right here, we're going to see that it brings us to a very familiar location. You can see literally, if I had Power BI datasets, it'd be right here. If we needed a gateway, they would show up. It would let us know we'd have to define it, but it tells us for this one, which is using Azure SQL Database and in our case just a web, it says you don't need a gateway because all are in the cloud, which is awesome. That's why I wanted to go this route. And you can see there's an option, schedule refresh. It really is this straightforward. I turn it on, I want to do it daily, I want to do it weekly. What's the time zone? What time do I want to refresh this at? Notice how I can set this up though. I can choose an hour, and then the minute section, you can only set this for the half hour and the on the hour. This is why we said with premium, you can do this 48 times per day. Technically, that allows you to set a refresh for every potential interval that's available to us within the user interface, the UI. Because there's only 48 of these periods throughout a day. That's why it has that number. But it should be noted, guys, that there's actually some external methods in which you can refresh Power BI datasets as well as data flows. So you can use things like XMLA endpoints. You can actually use things like Logic Apps or Power Automate to basically make HTTP calls to the back-end Power BI API. There are ways that you can refresh your data sets, so your standard Power BI data sets, and your Power BI data flows without having to lean on this UI. But regardless, even if you go that method, the limitations of 8 times per day for Pro and 48 is still in play when we talk about premium and those likes, right? So really cool ways to do it. I really like Power Automate. Logic Apps, both are these items which are based off of triggers. So, you know, maybe this table in SQL Server, that gets updated, right? Because maybe that's what my data flow is pulling data from. That SQL Server gets updated. I can make Power Automate watch for that, and when there's an update to that, it triggers it, and then boom, I can send a request to update or send a refresh request for the data flow that's pulling data from that location. Pretty awesome. Also, I just can't go into much more detail of this. Don't forget that in the future here, we're going to have access to what are going to be called Power BI streaming data flows. Something you're going to want to look into. It's a way to kind of move around, not having to have a scheduled refresh here. So that is going to be a really cool introduction to this kind of entire Power BI data flows scenario. All right, so what we'll do, guys, we talked about the common data model. We broke down kind of workspaces and some of the licensing requirements and all of those fun elements. What we're going to be doing here is we're going to take our 15-minute break, and then when we come back, we're going to have some conversations around ingesting this, right? Let's talk about what are the different options we have. We've actually already seen one. We can ingest data flows via linked tables, so that's the one way. And of course, how do we access this through Power BI Desktop and take advantage of it? So that's what we're going to be taking a look at. We're going to examine that right when we come back from this break. All right, guys, welcome back. Just a quick little break. I was just kind of perusing through the chat there just to kind of take a look. There's a couple questions of interest that I was kind of looking at. Let me actually bring up where I was looking here. 1 second. There we go. So I was taking a quick little gander, and I saw some questions. I think I mentioned it when we were talking about it, but not available in the My Workspace, so you always have to create a workspace. Don't forget the whole nuances of the types of workspaces. There were some items there that talked about, what about modeling, right? What about modeling? I see that you're doing the shaping side of things. How can I create relationships between my dimension tables and my fact tables? You guys are on point. I just saw the chat. Everybody's getting involved. I love it. But yes, the answers that were given in the chat are correct. Right? This is going to be basically just the shaping portion of things. We're connecting to sources, we're creating business rules, and then we're storing those in tables. And then it would be something in the form of Power BI Desktop, which we're going to do momentarily. We would connect to that corresponding data flow itself, choose the tables that we would like, and now we're in the Power BI Desktop and we can take advantage of the modeling tab. We can go ahead and add some DAX. We can create those relationships. So it is here where we would accomplish that modeling phase. Now, don't take this with an absolute grain of salt. This is me just as a user of Power BI Desktop. Think of me as disconnected from like Pragmatic Works or Microsoft or anything like that. I don't want this to be taken and say it for truth. Don't quote me on this one. But if we look at the direction in which Power BI has been going and the service itself, right now a lot of people are saying, well, you know what? If we're talking about Power BI Desktop and we're talking about using Premium, which, with the new Gen 2 stuff and the performance, this is like a superset of analysis service. Like the grade and degree of features that we're getting with Power BI is amazing. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see some sort of extensions continuing into the service. Maybe we'll have some aspect of modeling that will eventually become available to us in the service. But as of right now, that is not available. There's nothing on the roadmap that I'm aware of, but who knows, right? With how fast and frequent and how much Microsoft has invested in this tool, it is only going to continue to grow with the feature sets that we have available. So just wait and you'll see. So we have the dimensions and facts modeling. That's going to be on the desktop. We're going to see that here momentarily. I do believe I saw another question that was already answered as well. Let me remind myself, where was it? We're talking about incremental refresh. Yeah, that is an option. I'll show that really quick before we get back to the slides. Basically, there's two options when you do incremental refresh, which once again, you set it at a table level. So when we saw schedule refresh, that was at the data flow level. That's for like everything. But you can actually go into individual tables and you can set incremental refresh, which remember, premium only here. But you basically let it and decide. You have to have a table that's designed in a certain way because it says point to a column that we're going to look at, right? That has a date. And then we're going to look at basically a threshold of if this is within a certain amount of time, those are the only records that we're going to be looking to update. And even further, the second portion of an incremental refresh is you can specify detect data type changes, and you specify a column, and if the maximum value of this column changes, then those will be the only records that actually get updated. So there's definitely some nuances. Jeremiah put some links in the chat that talk about incremental refresh. They talk about those items, so definitely check that out. It's a cool way, especially if you're working with larger data sets, it is a way that you can reduce the amount of time that's taken to refresh these items. So a couple of items there. Also, just be aware, I think we had a message put on there. Can we consume multiple data flows from a single PBIX file? Can we mix data flows and data sets in the same PBIX? So right now, we'll kind of look at this momentarily. There are some preview features in play with Power BI Desktop. When we connect to it, the way I have mine set up, it's going to be import mode. So with import mode, you can basically bring whatever you want into Power BI, right? Literally, I can bring in this data flow, that data flow. Like you can bring in whatever you want when we talk about imports. If you're less savvy or knowledgeable on that topic around imports versus direct query, we won't have the time to go too deep into that, but right now when I connect to data flows, it's going to be an import, so I can just bring in whatever I want. As many things as I want. Excel, data flow, SQL Server. But there currently is a preview. Right now there's a preview option that you would have to set up in your tenant. So in the service area, you'd have to set this up. We have to use the preview Gen 2 compute optimized engine. So there's a couple things you have to flip on in the back end. But this will allow you to leverage direct query with data flows. It's direct query is awesome. It's a super powerful feature. You don't have to do any sort of refreshing. If you're unfamiliar with direct query, definitely check that out. But right now, in the current iteration, the current preview, we're not going to be showing off preview features because they're apt for changes so very rapidly. But right now, in the current preview of direct query with Dataflows, you cannot leverage composite models, right? You can't do a direct query and an import, so that would be a scenario where you would only be able to point to one data flow. So that's kind of a long-winded answer for the question I just saw there. But when you're doing import, you can do whatever you like. That's kind of a really cool strength, but that means that you're bringing all the data from whatever your source is, you're loading it into the Power BI model, which will require a refresh of that Power BI data set itself. But like I said, if we're refreshing that data flow, that's getting fed right into the Power BI report. We just need to make sure it's being refreshed. So it's a really cool thing. And like I said, when streaming data flows comes into play, I think that's going to add a whole new kind of avenue when it comes to Power BI. So I think it's going to be a really cool thing. So let me go ahead and bring this up. It's been mentioned, but I do want to make it formally put out there, guys, so we don't miss out on this. This is actually available right now. So we're going to have something going for a limited time here. Check out the on-demand learning platform. I know some of you already are members. We love you. We appreciate you. Hopefully you're enjoying the updated content. We're actually excited because we're going to be revealing something new here in the future, not too far off. And we're continuing to just add new content, update what we have. If you haven't checked it out, sign up at least for a trial. You get 7 days to kind of view most of the material. But there's I think there's 7 or 8 in-a-day classes that you get free for life, right? App in a day, dashboard in a day, robotics process automation in a day, paging. So many good classes, guys. Definitely go check it out. This promo is going to be running, as you can see, until next Tuesday, ending at midnight. So make sure you take advantage of that. I mean, guys, tons of classes, 50 plus classes here. If you're just talking about Power BI, we have over 12 classes right alone in there. So definitely just an exciting little resource that you can tap into and leverage. Another thing of note that I will be bringing up at the end of the session, just as a reminder, we are going to be having these Learn with the Nerds. We're going to continue this moving onwards and forwards, different topics. Next time we're going to be having the man, the myth, the legend himself, Mr. Brian Knight is going to be joining us. And we're going to be doing that August 12th, 11 to 2, same time frame, East Coast time frame, and it's going to be all around Power App portals, right? Dataflows, it's kind of still a little baby as far as, you know, how much time it's been in existence. It's still relatively young, but Power Apps portals, even younger. This is a relatively new interface, and it's awesome in the Power App space, allowing us to give a capability of sharing our awesome apps that we've created with external customers. That's the idea behind it. There's a programmatic element in play here, but that's what we're going to be looking at on August 12th. So if you haven't already signed up, when that opportunity comes around, get situated, get ready to pop that popcorn and enjoy another 3 hours, and this time with Mr. Brian Knight himself. So like I said, I'll bring this back up in case anyone's maybe still on the break and miss this out, so you're reminded so you don't miss out on that additional free event that we're going to have going on there in a couple months. So with that being said, let's return back here, right? This is where I've left off. Let's remind ourselves, right? Right now, I'm living inside of my workspace. I've created right now 2 data flows. Our first one was here. This one was available for any licensing type, Pro, Premium, Premium per user, all of them. Good to go, which is amazing. From there, I went ahead and introduced a new data flow, right? This one right down here. And this one went through the process of using a linked entity. Basically, I took this table, there was one table that's part of this data flow, and I built a new data flow which brought that in as a linked table, and I added more to it. And we saw how that manifests itself. We saw how it presents itself inside the data flow, saying, hey, you can't make any changes. This is a read-only. Don't know what that's about. I thought I closed it correctly, but this is a read-only type of scenario. If you want to make changes, go back to you got to go to the source data flow itself. And it's got a little link here that takes you right to it. You can make your adjustments as you see fit, but this was when we started into the foray of creating. This is a Power BI data flow, which must be premium per user or dedicated capacity. And also, since we were already in that realm of premium, we decided to go ahead and add in these calculated tables, right? This is the symbol which represents the calculated table itself here. So that also, premium per user, premium capacity. And we saw how very easy it was to kind of stumble into this area. Also, I did note and saw a comments earlier. Hopefully that example kind of answered that question. There was something around, hey, I've been trying to do combined data inside of Power Query. There was errors occurring. In that scenario, I went ahead and did a merge. So that's an example of combining data. The other one will be appending data. So I'm not certain if that answered that question. I do believe historically in the past, there were some oddities with doing combination of data. And one of the ways you would go around it is by basically copying that code. Like I mentioned, you can go to Power BI Desktop, do what you need to do, right? And I'll show this in a moment. In the Power Creator, whenever you're doing this, you could just take and copy that code, and you can just put it into what's called a blank query in a Dataflow. And that's kind of like a very fast way to take what you've done in Power BI Desktop and just like turn it into a Dataflow. Just take the code and copy it over. It's an interesting approach. I do believe that was a method from before, but as you saw, I did just use a combined data capability, and all was well and good. So hopefully that kind of helped answer that question. Now here we are. We just saw when we're talking about the standard schedule refresh, that's at the Dataflow level, but when we get into the Dataflow, we do have options here for refreshing at an individual, at a table level. You can incorporate incremental refreshes here. Basically, you're going to be setting these guidelines, and you can see the UI pops up, and it's just telling you, do you want to use this? Yes or no. You have to specify a date time column that you're going to be looking at. So you have to have a design that's meant to support incremental refresh. You must be thinking about this even before you get into data flows. We need a column that is going to be kind of like a created on, a modified on, something that is tracking when this record is being inserted or updated. Because remember, this is coming from Azure SQL Database. That's where this source resides. So something is responsible for loading that Azure SQL Database. And we're going to want to track and keep an eye on when that's occurring, what records are being updated. So we simply point and indicate a column in question. We say how long we want to record this. I want to go back and store rows in the past quarters, months. You just choose what's the increment and what is the period, and then you want to refresh and you specify how much. So you definitely want to larger, want to keep the last year, let's say, or something like that. You can choose this effectively as a method of partitioning this, and I only want to keep the last, I want to be refreshing the last 5 months. You kind of just have to figure this out, what it makes sense. Definitely check out the article that we posted in the chat. It talks about some of the kind of best practices and understanding efficient incremental refreshes so that you can make sure that we're not getting duplicates, we're not missing out items. Deletes can be a little bit odd if you're setting this up, so you have to be wary of deleting. So if a source does handle deletes, you have to take some additional steps here, but that's more on like the back end. Or you could also say, as well as having these increments set up, these thresholds established above, you can also specify a column like a modified on or this technically doesn't even, it has to be date, time, but it could be something a little bit different than what's above. And it's literally going to capture, it's going to be caching this data, this one column, it's going to cache for each row what the maximum value is there. And when that increases, when that maximum value increases, so as a newer date is put in there, like modified by, and that increases, that triggers that we're going to be doing an update. So, there's an option. Once again, this is only going to be, you can see you can only refresh complete months. So there is a lot of options of consideration when you're going to be going into this option. So, also, now I'm thinking about it, there's one last question. I can get caught into so many of these guys because you guys are being so active and involved. I think I did see a question about updating, like going back to the source system. Can it be used to update the source system? And that is not the case, right? We are collecting, so in the ETL process, our load is effectively limited. That would be the idea, right? In a traditional ETL tool, what you choose your source and you choose your destination. Here we effectively don't have a variety of destination choices. You either load to the default Power BI storage. If you've chosen to attach your Azure Data Lake storage, it'll go there. Or lastly, effectively that's it. That's where it's going to be landed in one of those two areas. That's all. So we can't choose to kind of update a SQL table, right? So it isn't going to impact other sources. We're not going to be adjusting it. We're just taking from various sources and we're loading it into these two areas, whether it's our bring our own storage type of item or not. So I think I did see that. You're going to have your own separate ETL process that updates and handles those source systems. This would be something different. But this is meant to serve as, in effect, like a centralized reporting layer. You hear these talks about, enterprise data warehouses. To a degree, we're getting to the point of functionality here where we can start bringing in stuff from so many different sources and creating these entities right here that users can connect to. Now, it's from a shaping perspective. But as we're going to see in a moment, we can still do the modeling and handle that in Power BI Desktop, the relationships and the model enhancements with DAX and something of that nature. So I know there's so many more questions. Those are just ones that stuck out in my mind. Like I said, once the class is said and done, we kind of scrutinize and we go through all those questions, and I'll kind of pick those out, some that I think weren't answered in the class, and we'll look to have like a follow-up video or potentially like a blog that I have there as well. So keep on asking those. Don't think they're going to get lost in the wakes. We're going to scroll through it. There's just only so much time, and that time is 3 hours, guys. So let's take advantage of the hour that we have left. All right. Right over here, I'm going to dive back over into the mix very quickly, very short. Integration, right? We've already seen it. We've already witnessed how we can consume this inside of Power BI Service, right? Using the linked entities. That was one quick way of consuming it. Technically, the whole import and export, that's kind of touching them too. And technically also Azure Data Lake is in play if we combine it and bring our own storage solution. That's at the workspace level. But one of the natural ways we're going to also take advantage of this is going to be through Power BI Desktop. And I think I saw the conversation already in the chat. It was brought up there that there is a Dataflow connector. And actually there was another question on how can users see this. The permissions, as you can see right here, it's based on workspace access. So it's a bit different than Power BI datasets. You can literally go to a Power BI dataset and just individually grant users permissions to that dataset by itself. So it has a kind of a more fine grain level of access. With Dataflows, it's going to be based on workspace permissions. But of course there is, and that's really one of the main reasons why the read-only access is available to us for that, because we don't, there's going to be certain users that we may want to have access to this, but we also don't want them the ability of editing the data flow, so you grant them read access. It's just the reader access role inside of the workspace itself. Of course, if someone is a contributor or a member or an admin, they as well, of course, will have that capability of seeing the various data flows inside of Power BI Desktop, right? But as far as editing it, basically the author edits the data flow itself, but that's all done in the service itself. But once again, we can grant users administrative access to the workspace so that users can go in, because that's what it's all about. It's all about that collaborative kind of interface. That's what we want that capability of doing. So let's go ahead. I'm going to launch Power BI Desktop, and I'm going to connect to my effectively Power BI service and see all of the data flows that we have there, and we're going to bring that in to Power BI. So let me go ahead. I'm going to close out of this guy here. I'm going to launch Power BI Desktop. And let me go back to kind of the generic screen so we can see all of our data flows here so we can get an idea, right? This is the Data Flows Learning with the Nerds workspace. We have all these various data flows, and let's not forget, within those data flows, we have various different tables, right? That's the whole idea. Actually, I think I already had it open. Let me go ahead and close this extra one. All right, let's make sure it's the only one I have open. It is. There we go. All right, so I'm here. Naturally, we do need to be, technically, interesting enough, you technically don't even have to be logged in over here on the right-hand side. That is how we, can connect as far as publishing and getting various different items for custom visualizations. But when we choose the option, and let me make sure I don't have this already kind of cached. Power BI natively caches data connections. Cool, I don't have it cached. But I would say, all right, word on the street, right? They've told me that there's a data flow that I have access to. And you can see they are promoting here the Power BI data sets. I think once we see things like, once the direct query option of data flows becomes GA, once streaming data flows become GA, if I was a betting man, I wouldn't be surprised if you saw Power BI data flows right here, front and center. I think it's going to be a really cool and very, very real option for many users. But it's not here now. But I can hit the get data. It is listed under common data sources. We can see it right here. And when we select this, it's going to ask me. This is a cool thing, right? It's not using my login here. This allows me to, at this point, I could be logged in, and there are situational times, and some of you in this very call might be part of what's called a multi-tenant environment, where you maybe have, this is the main company's Power BI tenant, and maybe we work with another client, and there's a second one that I'm a part of, right? Maybe I work in 2 different areas. This just lets you sign in to whatever organizational account you need. So it basically supports multi-tenant capability, which is pretty cool. And just in case, I just happen to see, Dirk, you're spot on that answer. So looking good, my friend. Thank you for that. So let me go ahead and get signed in. I'm using the same credentials to match the Power BI tenant that I know my data flows exist in. So let me go ahead and sign in on this guy. All right, being signed in, I can go ahead and hit connect. And what we should see here is my tenant. And we can see, look at all these fun guys. And it's there, guess what? Dataflows, learning with the nerds. I expand it. There are my various items, the date dimension. Here's our first one. Here's the one with the linked table right here. And I can expand it, and these just look like tables, right? Now, also, it should be noted, something I kind of didn't showcase, there are methods inside of the Dataflows itself that you can actually not load a table into the model itself, because in this case, I did label this correctly, where I can say, hey, you know what, I want to bring in the date table. I have customer, but hey, there's an enriched customer, right? I could do that one. Here's products, and I'll grab internet sales. But there's actually a method in which, in the Dataflow side, we can actually make it so this isn't actually loaded. It's part of the metadata, because obviously we need it, right? Number of transactions is basically derived from fact internet sales tables, and we did some stuff there. And then we merged it into enriched customers. So you can actually make it so if you didn't want your users to see these items, you can actually go ahead and disable them from being loaded into the actual model. So in this case, it's all visible. So it's good that I did some labeling so users can see I've got 2 customer tables. Which do I want? I see enrich, that's going to draw my attention, so absolutely this is what I'm going to use. And then I can go ahead and load this in, right? And or we could hit transform. Because right now, as mentioned, I don't have the direct query option turned on, it's preview, but we could potentially now at this stage continue. Even though I used data flows to kind of create standardized tables, this still allows my users to introduce their own business logic on top of it. Because that very well may be the scenario, right? Steps 1 through 25, right? These are the 7 tables I know my organization needs to use, and these are going to be the 27 steps that I know everybody's going to need done for this data set. Boom. I take care of it. I do it into Power BI Dataflows. Now I make it available to them, and maybe the finance individuals. They're going to go ahead and add their own little, maybe they want to change and do something in the Power Query Editor for themselves. And then the operations does something for themselves. And of course, the logistics, whoever it is, they can further and extend this logic. This is, as you can see, if you haven't been in Power BI Desktop and you haven't used it, pretty deja vu-ish here, right? Home ribbon, you got the formula bar, you got the applied steps. Power Query Editor Online. That's what we're talking about. Dataflows is Power Query Editor Online, and this is the Power Query Editor in the desktop. So just very, very familiar interface. And we can make changes, right? I don't want this, you can kind of make these updates. Maybe I want to get rid of, this title. This is representing like a dimension table. Maybe I don't want that anymore. Makes sense from a naming convention. Let's make these updates. It should be noted, and I'll call this like customer. I know it's enriched. That's okay. I don't need to put that out there. It should be noted as well, right? We can go ahead and say, and make all these changes. We have full access to the Power Query Editor here. It's pretty awesome and amazing. The one thing to know, I only want to mention this because I've kind of been like promoting it and kind of saying how cool it's going to be for anyone who's worked with direct query. There are pros and cons. There are definitely considerations if you want to go it. But now that we know Dataflows is going to have this ability, it's going to eventually be generally available so that you can leverage direct query. Do note that it limits. So right here inside of the Power BI Desktop, if I use direct query to connect to a data flow, my capabilities of working in the Power Query Editor becomes limited. You can't do everything here. That's just the nature of using direct query because nothing will be stored in the local Power BI model. Basically, I think in the documentation they use a phrasing that is you cannot use complex M query transformations. Something that falls into this category, which is very common, is any form of combining data. Really causes a lot of issues. And there's other various transformations too that you just can't take advantage of. So direct query, there's a time and a place. Definitely check up on it if it's an unfamiliar term, an unfamiliar connection method. But once direct query is there, and they add the capability of composite models, if you're going to write anything down from this webinar, direct query, composite models, data flows, when all three of those worlds come together, it's going to open up some new horizons. Very exciting stuff. Very exciting stuff. But you can see, I can make whatever changes I want. I can remove columns. And I say, you know what? Let's go ahead here. Give me a second. I just realized I want to go ahead. This one also is how you can go ahead and kind of go into that direct query mode. And I'm going to access, now it's cached my connection, so it already knows what user credentials I want to use, but I say, you know what, I forgot. I actually also want to go ahead and bring in that failed banks information, right? And go ahead over here, hit OK, and there we go. I know there was a direct question about this saying, can I bring in data from multiple data flows? Boom, there you go. Reminder, right now with direct query, this would not be able to be accomplished. You basically, with a direct query, can only make one singular connection here. So that means to one data flow, only the tables in that data flow. But when composite model shows up, when that comes into play, sky's the limit. Sky's the limit, ladies and gentlemen. So it'll be very exciting. Now this really doesn't make much sense. Failed banks is a completely disconnected data set. It's okay though. We're not going to like dive into the realm of visualizations. But honestly, at this point, I'm here. I'm inside of the Power BI model. It's going to load this in like normal. I could access over here, you know, the modeling view, and I can start defining relationships. But we're going to see, as Power BI does, it tries to automatically detect it. So it's going to create a couple of these relationships for me, which is beautiful. But I can adjust this. We are in what's now called the semantic layer, right? I'm in the Power BI model. I can define these relationships as I see fit, right? So very nice, easy, clean to access. I can do relationship stuff. I can start adding calculated columns. I can take advantage of our DAX. Don't forget, we got to learn with the nerds. 3 hours of DAX. Maybe you went through that and you got all that skill set. You can do and take advantage of all those capabilities right here. All the while, it's coming from a centralized, standardized source, which was done and created using Power BI Dataflows. That's its purpose. That's its ideal. That's what it's meant to be used for. And you can now kind of, you know, roll this out for the entire organization. I do feel like there's a lot of parallels here with how you can leverage Power BI data sets with how we're discussing how you can leverage or roll out Power BI data flows. There are some parallels, but do remember, data flows, it's all in the service. Significantly better for managing and collaborating with fellow users within the organization. That's one of those key things. So, let's go ahead and real quick, we aren't going to be able to show a composite model, but a composite model is simply just some tables are direct query, some tables are import. That is literally a very simple definition, but a 100% accurate definition. It's that simple. Of course, it relies on what sources you're working with, but that's all a composite is. Some are direct, some are import. That's all. Definitely check it out. It's a really cool topic. Supported in various areas. Right now, not supported with data flows though. So do keep that into consideration. So that's how easy it is so that we can use, our users can do this. And as a reminder, right, this is my workspace. I just need to go here and give access to whoever I want to be able to see this. I simply add them right here. Who do I want to add? Simply use that email address. This is tied into my organization's Azure Active Directory, and I assign them the role. In this case, all roles, viewer and above, if we assign viewer, those users would have the ability of seeing a data flow, right? And that's more than likely going to be what you're going to use. Possibly contributor, very popular option as well. But users must be in this list in order to be able to see your Power BI data flows. And not to be remiss or not to leave this out, because I did mention in the beginning, but it is very critical, it's very important, is don't forget, right? We talked about link tables, that's a way to ingest. We just showed Power BI Desktop. That's a way to ingest. And let's not forget, if you decide to go the route of bringing your own storage, so you tie it to your Azure Data Lake, you've just opened up the world to whatever Azure services you'd like to use. Now we have data stored inside of an Azure Data Lake Gen2 storage account. Azure Data Factory, Spark Notebooks, Azure Machine Learning Services, they all give you the ability of connecting to blob storage accounts. And actually, technically, Power BI gives you access to connect to blob storage accounts. So with the correct established permissions, because you'd have to do a little bit extra, you could use that connector in Power BI Desktop and then connect to the CSVs in the data lake itself. Now, granted, it's a far more organic experience using the Power BI Dataflow connector, especially, you can import. So it's kind of odd that you would go that route, but maybe. But by using the bring your own data, your own storage option, it just opens up a whole new world. That has its own ramifications, that has its own nuances, once again, about permissions. There is now additional costs from an Azure perspective. In my opinion, Azure billing is a whole conversation on its own, but storage accounts are pretty darn efficient as far as cost-wise. And what we store, as far as structurally, how the data flows are stored, it's pretty small in scope and size. They do a fair amount of compression there. So definitely something to take into consideration. It is a pretty robust consumption side, but you have to attach your own storage. So you may or may not go that route. Now, let's adventure into the world, which some of you might have been waiting for this topic and conversation, but let's adventure into the world of AI insights. Ooh, artificial intelligence. Definitely one of those buzzwords that users use tons. This is one of those things that everyone loves. AI. And you might have noticed AI insights was showing up when I was creating a data flow. It was there. So we're going to look at a couple of these options. Of course, it should be noted right off the bat, all of these features will require premium per user or premium per capacity. So it's falling in that realm. I've said it a lot of times. I apologize if I sound like a broken record. Yes, you can use this if you don't have premium. It is somewhat of a linear road, but you can connect to tables, clean those tables, and then store those tables in the service, and now they're available to your users in the organization. Just linked tables, calculated tables, and these insights are going to be premium only. So you just kind of have to stay in that area. But if this is something you're interested in, then you may have to consider, and you know what? The introduction of Power Premium per user is a very interesting thing, right? I was very excited when they announced that price point. I know spending money is never exciting. You always kind of say, oh, why can't they just give it to us for free? But the price range and the capability of what can be found in Premium per user is pretty darn attractive. Definitely look at the nuances of how the Premium per user license is leveraged, because it's a little different than you might expect, but you can use all of these things that we're talking about. And by default, it's going to be $20 per user. If you have Pro, it's technically $10 per month. But definitely check out what PPU is all about, how you can share things with PPU, because that is its own conversation. I just wanted to turn you guys on to that topic, and that since it's so fresh and so new. I want to say it just became available GA either at the end of March or beginning of April, so it is a baby still. And who knows where we're going to go with what features are there and what they might add to it. But it is an interesting option, a very interesting option. But AI. Right? When we go into the insights, we're going to see we have things like language detection. We're going to check out here an example of sentiment scoring, which is pretty awesome. Key phrase extraction, all these really cool things. And really, when we're talking about the world, right, of cognitive services, right, these little features and all these different items, there's a couple of different fun conversations that can be looked at in this area. So like sentiment scoring, we're literally going to be working in the world of machine learning here. But when we go into sentiment scoring, basically this is an already created. So you're taking advantage of Azure's what's called cognitive services. And they've already done this, right? They use in the background. Now, trust me, I could go on for ages on this. I love talking about this. So I'm going to try to talk about this in the most kind of linear way I can, because when we start talking about AI, when we start talking about data science, when we talk about machine learning, this is a whole nother world, and I don't want to throw things out there that will cause confusion. But you should get excited. These are cool things. And the services themselves are built on this technology. So when we choose to use, let's say, like any sort of text analytics, in the back end, Azure has already kind of created a machine learning classification algorithm, and it is what generates a sentiment score. We're going to see it's going to give us a score between 0 and 1. Items that are closer to 1, that indicates like a positive score. Those closer to 0, that means negative. But the model we use, the model that Azure has created, it's already been pre-trained with an extensive body of text and various different sentiment associations. They've already done these items where they say, you know, these words represent good, these represent bad. They've done all of this work, and it's very extensive. At the moment, right, at the moment, we cannot create our own, train our own model on sentiment analysis. We can't provide what's called training data. More on that later on. We just can leverage what Azure has already done. But as mentioned, very extensive, and it uses a combination of techniques while we're doing text analysis, like things like text processing. It is part of speech analysis, word placement, word associations, tons of different things, guys. A lot of fun with the cognitive services. The same can be said if we go over into the realm of tag images. Basically, it's a pre-created machine learning model which is based off of thousands of recognizable objects. Living beings, scenery, actions, and it uses all of this. It uses all of this in combination with what's known as CV, or computer vision algorithms, to output tags based off of the objects itself. Pretty cool stuff. And lastly, definitely not least, we'll have to see, because this goes into a realm far more advanced, but Azure Machine Learning Integration is an option that's available to us within Dataflows that we can look at and that we can examine. So premium only. This is going to be premium. There's also, if you have Azure embedded, technically that is another way that you can create a workspace, but premium per user, premium per capacity, and there's also embedded capacity workspaces. Those are going to be the only ones. It does only support online data sources, so right now we can't tie this with the data gateway, but that should be changing. And basically you just have to make sure that you've turned on these features inside of the admin portal. Basically everything that you can do in the Power BI service in the admin portal, there are switches to turn things off and to turn things on. Now this last item, permission and access to the Azure portal, this basically coincides with what we talked about with Azure Data Lake Storage. If we wanted to be able to access a machine learning experiment, so if we create something in Azure, through Azure Machine Learning Services, we would have to turn on and grant access to our Power BI tenant so we could see it. But we're going to go a different route. Dataflows allows us the capability to create a machine learning experiment, specifically an AutoML experiment, inside of the Power BI service itself. So we don't actually have to step foot into the Azure portal. This is one of those kind of advancements that they're doing to make it so that the Power BI service and the desktop, like this ecosystem of Power BI, is going to be this very robust set of features that really kind of gets into that enterprise realm. It's really exciting to see where Power BI is going right now. So that's what we're going to take a gander at, guys. We're going to dive in and we're going to take a look at some examples from some cognitive services, right? So to begin, let's go ahead and go into the realm of text analytics. Specifically, we're going to look at sentiment analysis. We talked about that. It uses pre-trained models. Let's go ahead and import some data into the Dataflow. Let's score the sentiment, and we're going to go ahead and get those scores back to us. And we can observe and we can see. If we want, we can connect to it with Power BI and see exactly what's going on with it. So the first things first, also we have to make sure that, you know, we've turned these features on, but we're going to go ahead and connect and create a new data flow. It's going to be a new table. So technically, this is where it gets kind of funny. We technically are going to start with an option that we've talked about that can use just Pro. You don't need Premium, but those AI features are going to require that the data flow we're creating be in a workspace that is either Premium per user or Premium per capacity. So I'm going to go ahead. We're going to go to new as we've done in the past, right? I'm going to go to a new data flow, which brings us to our favorite little four little options. And I am going to choose that option on the left-hand side, right here, add new tables, all right? As soon as we go into this little space, into this little area here, we are going to end up using the text CSV option once again. And to try to make your life easier, I have a link that just points to a CSV. Let me see if I can get this in the chat. I think it was working. I think it looked like it came up a little bit odd last time, so hopefully it comes out okay here. If we need to, basically what you need to do in there is simply right-click and copy that link address. The chat kind of like shortens it, so make sure you copy that out there. So that's going to go into play. Once you've collected that information, like I said, you don't need to follow along. I'm going to provide all of these URLs in a text file that will be able to be downloaded post this class, so you can watch it in the recording at your, at your leisure, at the pace that you want. But we're going to use the text CSV option again, right? Go in and paste my URL here, which is just some kind of standard, options, nothing too crazy here. And we're going to go in and look at what this is all about. So I'm going to hit next, let it connect, bring in that data, let it do its thing here. Say, oh, there we go. And we can take a moment to examine this, right? This is just some data that has, as you can see, a comments section. So once again, it's this company called Fabricam. You can see it has like this this topic, its email, subject, the name, the user ID. It's just basic stuff in here. What we're really interested in is right here, right? We have this comment box. And the idea is we're going to go ahead and use this box. We're going to feed this box here, comments, this column, to a trained model, which is going to return us a score, which, as we remember, sentiment analysis basically is what's called a classification model, and it returns values that fall in between 0 and 1. It's going to fall in that range. Things that are closer to 1, positive. Things that are closer to 0, negative. Items that fall in the middle, because it actually takes the time, observe it. Some things that are basically found to be objective, there isn't enough information for it to figure out whether it falls positive or negative. Actually, will just fall right smack dab in the middle. So a lot of times you'll just see straight up a 0.5 or something of that nature here. So this is just the preview, so we can go ahead and, of course, hit transform data. That actually brings us into the UI. I'm going to go ahead and hit this little guy over here to, give myself a little more room. And it's taking its moment in loading. There it is. But over here is my AI Insights, right? And when I click on this, it provides me the options. If I had a machine learning model that was available to me, it would actually show up here. But interesting enough, as I mentioned, I already created one ahead of time. And I'll explain why I did that. It'll make much more sense when that's the case. So it's thinking, it's looking, it's connecting effectively to the Azure services associated with my login. And we should see various different options under some cognitive services. So of course, it's taking a moment. We'll give it a second. It's taking its time with this, live demonstration. As it is, there we go. Now, in my case, because I have a trained model, this is showing up here, right? We'll assume, like I said, I'll explain this later. That's going to be the last example we do. What I'm most interested in is this. There's a possibility if you are following along and you are doing this, you have the premium and all that stuff. If you didn't have a model, this is all you'll see. The folder of the default cognitive services options. And you can see you have a couple and it explains. Tag images, we'll use that one next. Extract key phrases, sift through text and surface important phrases. Detect language, it returns literally, is it English, is it Russian, is it Chinese, pretty cool. And then we have the bottom one, which is the one we're going to be leveraging, which is going to be sentiment analysis. And you can see it really doesn't have many parameters here to fill out. All you need to do, the only required field, which is indicated by the asterisk sign, is what is the text that we're trying to figure out if it's good or bad, if it's positive or negative. And that phrase, you can see when you see the pencil, that just means like literal text, so I can type whatever I want. Obviously that's not going to work in this scenario. What we want is to hit the drop down and specify a column from the table that we're using in the background there. And that column is going to be called comments. So once I've chosen the option, once I've said I want to use a column, I can hit the drop down here and find comments, and that's basically it. We don't have to do any more. Now you'll notice that at the bottom there is this culture info, this language ISO code. It's optional. Like if we wanted to, we could put in the value of EN. If we knew the text was all English, You could specify language. This can make the process a bit more performant because now it doesn't have to try to figure out what language it is. So like I said, you could just simply put in a specific code in here. It uses the ISO format, so EN is English and so on and so forth. You just have to kind of look, what language do you want? What is the ISO code? And that can be those items, right? For us, we're just going to leave it blank. And Power BI first will go ahead and detect the language so we can see how that works. And then it's going to input a value. And it's going to give us the score. That's what it's called, the sentiment score. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply here, right? We can see that it's gone through and it's trying to invoke a function. And a little message came up here, and I'll show you where you can do this. It says, hey, we canceled this because combining data from multiple sources may reveal data from one source to another, right? There's this question around data privacy. It makes sense. What we can do is we can simply hit continue to say, I want to allow this. And I'll show you actually where this option is presented to you right here in the UI. Because you can just say, you know what, I know I'm going to be working with multiple sources. Let me go ahead and turn this on by default. Because by default, it's off. It's right here under options. For this, when I see project options, we're talking about this specific data flow. And you'll notice here is the check mark. Allow combining data from multiple sources. You can do that. In this case, the idea is we're effectively basically providing the source, in this case, from this online CSV to the source in our Azure Cognitive Services. That's what's going on here. Technically, if we had two different sources, maybe like this CSV from here and I had an Excel coming from somewhere else, we would still get this same message. So that's what it's talking about. You can manually turn this on if you so choose. Once again, that's located here under options. And there are actually technically some global options too that you can tinker with as well. But we've got the same table, right? But if I scroll to the right-hand side, we're going to see that we have a couple of options available to us, right? We're going to see that on the far right, we get our Cognitive Services score sentiment. And what I'm going to call this, I'm just going to clean this up, and I'm just going to call this my score. Now, formatting wise, I'm going to go ahead and change this over because this is something I haven't really talked about, but it is a conversation. We talk about data shaping, when we talk about the Power Query editor, whether you're in Power BI Desktop, whether you're in Dataflows, there are some basic things that should be considered for performance purposes, and one of those is proper data typing. Right? And when you see ABC123, this is an any data type. There can be some performance impacts here. And actually, if you notice, you can see this little guy. It says warning. If I look at what it's telling me, it says the query has an untyped column. So it's actually telling me, warning me about this. So you always want to strongly data type your columns. This has performance ramifications. This could have impacts on what transformational options you have available to you. So don't leave any ABC123s. Don't leave any data types. So I'm going to switch this over to a decimal number, fixing that little warning message. And I almost forgot my own advice, right? Look at the name of this. It's just called query. That's pretty terrible. Let's go ahead and call this something like customer comments, right? Nice, simple, straightforward. I can go ahead and save and close this. And we now have a data flow, which we just have to give it a name, right? As soon as we exit from this, it's going to tell me to name this. I'm going to give it the name of my company, something like that. And we could use Power BI Desktop to once again connect to this and see what's going on, just to see how this is actually working. So my data flow, I'm going to call this Fabricam. I think that was the name of the company. Customer comments. And we're going to say doing sentiment analysis on my customer comments, right? Something like that. And once we save this, it does ask me to refresh. It's important to note, actually, and this is something I haven't mentioned, when you finish loading a data flow and pointing to a table like we just have, by default, there is zero data that's in this table. If I connected to this right now with Power BI, nothing would be inside of this. When you finish, I guess the takeaway here is the Power Query editor, whether you're in the desktop tool, whether you're inside of Power BI Dataflows here, that's merely a preview of the data. We're looking at simply a sample of the data which we can create our business rules around. But right now, we've said, okay, I'm storing these rules, I'm storing these connections, all of that, but we technically don't have any data loaded into this. We actually need to go ahead and make sure that this gets refreshed. So one way, since that pop-up disappeared, there is the option here. Of course, you can just do an incremental, you could edit, but if I just go back over here, right, into my workspace, remember I showed this, we have our new one, which is Fabricam customer comments. I could just click here. Instead, I don't want to schedule something and wait for it. Let me just refresh this. And it should be noted as well, you can always observe, you can always look at what's going on here. If you hit the ellipsis, you'll see there is a refresh history, and it'll show you this is in progress, this has been completed, and there's some very interesting metrics that can be collected if you hit this download button here. This just gives you a CSV that you have that you can go through and see various different details about this. So let's go ahead and see here, it's still in progress. Let's take a look. Let me kind of refresh this and see, because we want to make sure when we look at this, it's 40 seconds. We want to make sure, of course, that there's data in here when we connect to it. So let's go ahead, open up Power BI Desktop. I'm going to go through the same method in connecting to this. And we'll see exactly what's going on. I'm just looking at the comments real quick. Not really certain, Nickel, I'm not certain exactly why that link wouldn't be working. It's just a public one. And that's a relatively correct statement there, Anthony. There's some nuances to it, but for the most part, that is correct. Let me go ahead, like we did before, right? Get data, data flows. Let's see, I'm hoping that it's been refreshed in the background, but the nice thing is I can just refresh my connection here. But we can go to, same thing, I'm going to go to the same workspace. We're going to see there's my Fabricam customer comments, and we can go ahead and connect to this. So there's customer comments. Let's take a look. Let's see if it's refreshed in that small moment. It did, so good timing. If it wasn't, that's okay. I could still technically connect to this, and I could have just hit the refresh button in Power BI once it was done. And if we wanted, once again, we could potentially transform this, right? I'm importing this data in here. If I wanted to make additional changes to it, I could. We can see, here's the information on the back end. But let's just take a look. Let's kind of examine what this has actually come up with, right? If I go in, just going to load this in real quick. I'm just going to pop this into a table real quick just so we can examine what this has come up with. Now, once again, something that's important to note and understand. In this scenario, since we don't have really much control over, we can't train the model ourselves. But although it is extensive, when you're working with machine learning, it's all about predictions. We're working in a realm of probability. We're training machine learning algorithms to try to figure out and understand patterns so it can take data and predict results. So, it's not going to be 100% correct. I mean, we try to strive to get the best machine learning model we can so that it can help us in the decision-making process. So let's take a look at how well this model worked. I'm just going to grab just a table, and you know what? I'm just going to keep it pretty simple. Who made the comments? What is the comments? And let's grab the score, right? I called it score. Let's go right here. And let me stretch this out. Let me go ahead and increase the size here real quick. I'm going to shrink this. Let me go ahead and fix the grid so you guys can see this a little bit better. I'm going to kind of fix the word wrapping here in a moment. So let's do that. Let me shrink this up. There we go. So I don't have to do any scrolling, right? So if we look at this, we can say, wow, I had no idea that reciprocating, and they use some kind of jargon words in here to kind of throw the model off just to see, but you can see I had no idea, I paid twice, they weren't nearly as smooth in operation, field ground delivery was a plus. So you can see like these are positive items and the score was a 0.99. So approaching 1 would be positive. If we go down to there's a 0.17. I've had similar problems tracking down another source of thingamabobs, or is it whatchamacallits? I found that they, but not reliably. Maybe it's starting to get more orders than would improve. So overall, that would veer to the negative, and it is showing in that score. And you can see this very bottom one, very disappointed as a result. I mean, you could go through this and look unhappy. That's the trick. This is being fed into a machine learning algorithm. we can't really see what's going on in there. To a degree, some would describe this as a black box operation here. We know what's going in, we can see what's coming out, but we don't get to see the process. That's kind of this one thing that's kind of missing here when we leverage the out-of-the-box cognitive services here, that they're using pre-trained models. Getting more advanced and getting nitty-gritty into machine learning, you can create your own models and train them to deliver this, and that would be supervised modeling, supervised training, and you're in control of it. But right out of the box, check it out. Looking at text, tell me if it's good or bad. It's a cool little way to go about this. And it didn't really take much. Now, once again, it is locked behind that premium paywall, but it's there, available to us. Let me sneak out of this. I'm going to load up a new one, again, a new Power BI desktop. That right there was an example of using sentiment analysis. Now, what about going into the realm of image tagging? Okay, let me go ahead. I kind of saved some code here. This might not copy that great into chat. I'm going to do my best here. Let me actually put this in like a notepad, see if it kind of goes a little bit better. But I'm going to use a blank query option here, okay? So we're going to do another data flow. The idea is this is going to use image tagging. So we're going to provide it. You technically can provide this data in the binary format. You can have explicit images, but this is going to use the cognitive service of image tagging. So we're just going to use a URL that points to 2 images, right? And if we wanted to, let me actually bring up these images. I'm going to put this in the chat. Like I said, it's a piece of code, so it doesn't look that great. In the resources that you'll be able to download after the class, I'll make sure it's included in there. Let me get to the point where I can get to my chat. There we go. Like I said, it's code. You don't if it looks too funky, it's actually beyond the character limitation here, guys. So I would just say watch this. But let me bring up to the screen what images we're going to be looking at, so we can get an idea. So this is going to be image number 1. All right. I'm just going to leave these up in the background. And here is going to be image number 2. Copy. Paste. I just kind of found some images, nothing crazy, just something, right? So these are what we're going to feed to Power BI, and we're going to put it through a CV algorithm, a computer vision algorithm, to kind of look at the image, look at objects, persons, themes, backgrounds, those type of things. That's the idea behind this. So let's see, based off of what we're seeing right here, how well this is going to look, right? So give me one moment. There we go. Let's go ahead and start this up. We're going to go do the same thing. We're going to go into create a new data flow, and we're going to go ahead and do the same thing as we did before. New data flow. We are going to use the define new tables, which once again is kind of interesting because we start in an area we've talked about that this is technically available for all licensing, but as soon as we take advantage of the AI insights, that one is going to be specific to Pro. And this time around, we're actually going to leverage the option called blank query. It's down at the very bottom of the options, just blank query. This is one of those methods I talked about early. It's literally just asking you to provide the code. So if you're less familiar with M and how to use this, this is probably an area you might not find yourself too often. But I did talk about, hey, if you did work in Power BI, you could technically copy the code from Power BI, and this is where you would paste it. So for me, I'm going to paste in this information. It should be fine. It's oddly formatted there. It's going to attempt, because we're connecting to a web URL, a public URL, it's saying, how do you want to connect? Do you need to use anonymous authentication, basic, organizational? In this case, I should be able to use anonymous. That should be perfectly fine. It's asking it for both of them. It's trying to combine 2 different URLs. We talked about this, so I'm going to allow that. And it's looking pretty unexciting. It's just storing binary data in here. It's the images. But now we can take advantage of the AI services, right? The cognitive services here, and do some image tagging. So what we're going to do is go back to our AI insights, right? We'll let this load up. It's going to access those default ones, and we saw it actually already has the some machine learning in there, but we're looking for the tag images option. Give it a second, give it a second. So let's find that guy. Tag images, just like that. It's already by default chosen the column option, and it's picked the column that meets our criteria. It's in binary format. And all we need to do is hit apply. It's going to go through, feed this to the algorithm, and it's going to return 2 columns for us. The tags themselves, and then it technically breaks down and gives us like the JSON representation of this. It just is a little bit of extra code. So we'll give that a second for it to, right now we're literally feeding this information to a trained model, and we're waiting for it to process that, and then it's going to return back the results. In our case, we're looking for tags. From that CV algorithm, what has it figured out? So we'll give it a second here to do its thinking. Give that a moment, give that a moment. Also, we'll probably want to rename this query as well. We'll call this image tagging. And while I was doing that, it looks like it finished in the background. But we can see, for our first binary image, it came back with flower, plant, yellow, colorful, and colored. It didn't bring up a butterfly. That would have been cool, but I mean, fitting pretty good. Our other one comes up with tree, outdoor, forest. It actually got real specific here. Conifer, nature, wooded, plant, hill, all this fun stuff. And you can see over here, it's getting a little more into the realm of machine learning on confidence levels and showing those different items. That's what's held in this JSON, what kind of confidence level it has for these respective tags it gave. So if you want to keep that, anything maybe that's lower than 0.53, maybe you want to go ahead and dump it. This one says wood, it's at 0.27 confidence, but I mean, there's wood in there, so that works for us. But this can be a item where maybe you decide to filter out records that are below 0.5 or something, right? You can eliminate some sort of image tagging that you find that isn't sufficient enough, or maybe is a bit too ambiguous. But right here, from this example, from this scenario, it's there. We can now take advantage of this. CV algorithms right here, built into Dataflows that we potentially could then leverage inside of, let's say, Power BI Desktop, wherever we want to use it. Remember, if we've tied this into our Azure Data Lake storage, technically this is now available for consumption for various different Azure services. So we really have a lot of options here to take advantage of these items. Now we're getting close to the end game, getting close to the buzzer here, guys. I'm going to try this. Next one is a pretty loaded topic. I was uncertain if we were going to go into this. Let me actually give the name of this image tagging. Let's go ahead and we'll call it AI Insights. This is just the name of my data flow, image tagging. But this next one we're going to look at is the AutoML capabilities. Now, we are not going to be able to create one. I'm going to walk through the beginning stages of creating something from scratch, but we're actually not going to go ahead and submit this and basically train the model as the process, what it's called, and you'll see why. But we'll start the process so you can see what this is all about, just because when you properly want to do this and set this up, you want to give the model enough time to be trained as much as possible. So you're going to see we're literally going to have a slider where you can decide on how much time it can take. The longer you allow a model to train, the more variations, the more what's called featureizations can be done against the data set to maximize and try to get the best model possible. So what we'll do is we'll walk through what this first little, basically it's a wizard, which is pretty awesome, what it gives to us. And at the very end, I'll end up canceling it because I can show you the output right here. We can see that I actually have this online shopper's intent. This actually is our trained model, and you'll see there's a report in here, all this stuff. But let's look at the beginning pieces of this. Like when it comes to machine learning, there's a lot, guys. And like I said, this was a topic I was uncertain if I wanted to bring up because there's a fair amount of conversation that can be had here. Machine learning and data science, it is its own realm of possibilities. And it can get crazy when you talk about the science behind it, the mathematics behind it. It's deep, guys. But this AutoML capability really makes it cool to take advantage of this, and we can literally use this and feed data into our model, and it brings back results. It's kind of interesting. So let me start this so you can see what it's all about. Right? Definitely something I recommend if you want to go further. There's some cool examples online. But if we go into new, as always, right, we're going to stick with the basics here. Just hit new. We can dive in and go through this process of creating a new data flow. Like I said, I won't hit submit at the very end, and you'll see why. But we're going to, basically the idea here is if I know I'm creating, the purpose of this is I want to create an auto ML experiment. You basically are creating a data flow that is going to supply the data that will be used for this auto ML experiment. This is called training data. So the tables that we define and we establish here, that's what's going to be used for what's called training and testing data. In our scenario, we're going to use a data set that's just talking about like shoppers' intention. It's just some data that was collected about their traffic on a website, how, what was their, and you're going to see there's various different areas here, and Power BI is going to do all this work to figure out which columns make sense, which are going to be helpful in predicting this, and it's like click view rates, bounce rates, various different terminologies used from like things like Google Analytics, all right? So for us, we're going to go ahead, we got our new item, I'm going to go ahead and choose text CSV. Let me go ahead and find my chat real quick. I'm going to put this link in here, but this one I would recommend sitting back and watching or waiting till the recording's up so you can take your time with this one because ML gets deep, guys. I'm going to go ahead and put this shopper's intent in. Like I said, this will probably bring us right up to the wire. You can see various different data, right? Just a bunch of different items. Some of these are internal metrics that they figured out, but you can see how much time did they spend on product related pages, what's the bounce rates, the exit rates, page values. These are all things that you can be found from like Google Analytics. So the only thing that I'm going to do here for transforming this data is this final column over here, which is called revenue. It's true or false. That's all that's here. This represents whether someone, based off of all of this activity, did they generate any revenue? Basically, did they buy something based off of all this time? So I'm just going to update this to true or false. That's the category that I'm going to put here. I'm also going to update the name of this, right? This is a pretty poor name. Let's call this online visitors or something of that nature. Online visitors. And pretty much that's all we need to do. The fact that we've updated and changed it to true or false, this is technically a data set that's set and ready to go, and I can simply just hit save and close. Now this column, revenue, we're going to see that's known as a target column. It's called a label column. That is the column that we want to predict. That's the idea behind it. Based off of all of these details, I can feed that to this machine learning model, and it'll tell me, based off of this, they should buy or they won't buy. Let me go ahead and call this my online shopper's intent demo, since I already think I have one that's called that. And all we've done at this point is just brought in a table from a CSV and we're loading the data into it. So we haven't done anything in the machine learning realm. But this is where we get introduced to how we can create and train a machine learning model. This is where we can say, hey, take this data, this information that we have inside of this online visitors example that I just created, we want to use that in this model to predict this column. I want you to use this data to train and test it. Basically, the data set that we have here will be split into two options. I believe by default it uses 80% of the data will be used to train the model. Very quick definition of that is we're just letting a machine learning algorithm look at all these results. We look at all of the points and we let it see the answer. Based off of all of this, they did have revenue. It's true. Based off of this, it's false. So it goes through all of the columns and figures out patterns. It uses statistical correlations, various different methods for featurization to try to see what are the columns here that give us the most influence to decide, yeah, if someone's high in this category, or maybe they're low in something else, or maybe this is a yes versus a no, this column is a high predictive value. So it takes the cumulative of all of that. It's doing a ton of work. That's why it's machine learning. That's why it's AI, putting it to work. And then it's going to return a score to us. That's what happens in training. And then we showcase it 20% of the data set, which it doesn't know the answers to, and it will bring back and predict the results. And that's how we call what's scoring it. How good did my model do? Based off of data it hasn't seen, how well did it predict those results? That's the goal. So very quickly, guys, there's a lot in here, but I just wanted to kind of show an ooh-ah feature. So don't worry about following along. Check the recording out. You can extend this and go further. But online visitors, I'm going to use this data to train and test a model. And we can see right off the bat, just saying, okay, we're looking at your table, which is the column that you would like to predict? And also, if there was multiple tables, that would show up. We only have one table here. Use that table, and the column that we want to know the outcome of is revenue. So I go, I select it, I hit next. It actually, on its own, will actually go ahead and do a preview here. It analyzes the values in that outcome column that we identified, and it will suggest the type of machine learning model that will be created. So it has chosen a binary prediction, true or false. That's all it is. Technically, this can be known as a bivariate classification. It's true or false, right? Binary, 2, that's what it's representing. If for some reason it chose this and you want a different model, very easily you can simply click this link here. It'll show you all the options of models that you want to choose from, and then you can make the corresponding choice. What we're saying is here, choose a target column, a target output column. Basically, in revenue, right, we have true and false. What is the outcome that you're most interested in? And for us, this is going to be true. Because that's what we want to know. Are people, spending time? That's what we want to predict. And we can use some friendly naming before to say what we're most interested in. So if it is true, what that represents is that they made a purchase. This is going to show up in the report after the fact. And we can say if it was false, which would be if it's a mismatch, there's only one other option, that means it was no purchase. So just giving it some friendly labeling. Oddly enough, it's not letting me really scroll down here, but I can barely see the option of next, so that's good. That's a weird little UI thing there. Maybe. Like I said, this is acting a little bit odd. Usually I can scroll and I can see that, so hopefully this continues to the next page. What's happening here, I think it is going forward, is Power BI is basically doing a preliminary scan of some sample data, and it's basically going to suggest to us which columns we should use when training this model. It's effectively using various different statistical methodologies to understand correlation between columns, highly correlated columns and non-highly correlated columns. It's doing this work for us, and it will say, we recommend using these columns. And you'll see, here it is. It's saying administrative, low correlation. Informative duration, low correlation. So it's saying, I don't want to, this is only and simply recommendations. We can decide, you know what, I understand this data. Maybe in the sample that it looked at, it came up with this, but I know this should have a higher level of correlation. I want to include this. So if you know and have an understanding of this, you could make some adjustments here and change which data is going to be used in this process. So you can make that decision. Now in the final step, and this is why I'm not going to just start and running it, we give our model a name. So you could call this whatever you want, purchase intent prediction, something like that, right? You could just give it a name, give it a description, and notice down below, training time. The longer you train your model, the more accurate the results. Train for short time if you just want to make sure you've selected the right data. So if you're looking for something more accurate, you want to do this. The lowest amount of time is 5 minutes, and as you can see, we can go all the way to 360. And it tells us what's going to happen next. It's going to take the data that's in that table, split it. 80% is going to be sent to train it, so it gives it the answer. It sees the values in the revenue column. And it's going to say, okay, let's figure out the patterns. And then the 20% is where it doesn't see revenue. It doesn't know if it's true or false, but it gives us the predicted values, and we can see how close it came. And the perfect part of this is it does provide us statistical metrics that are used for understanding the predictive power of models, but it actually provides us a pretty cool Power BI report that you can just examine it on your own. Pretty interesting. So at this juncture, if you've done this, if you're following along, if you went there, like I said, this was definitely more of a follow and watch scenario. You can go ahead and hit save and train if you'd like. Obviously, I'm not going to sit here and have you go wait 120 minutes. Even just setting it to 5 minutes, that's just literally, we can't do anything until it's done. So at this point, I'm actually going to hit cancel because back in my data flow, I have gone ahead and we can see I have online shoppers intent. And this is a trained model in here. Literally, I hit save and train. It creates these two tables, the training data and the testing data. Remember that 80-20 split. It used that, and then it creates these outputs. When you look at the model, which is right here, notice this has been here the whole time, been hiding, just haven't brought your attention to it. it is right here. And you can tell, see, it's been trained. When was the last time it was trained? If you want to retrain the model, if you want to, maybe there's more data, right? That online customers table that we loaded, that can be refreshed, right? You can refresh it. Maybe new data gets put in there, so you want to retrain the model. Maybe there's new patterns within the data that need to be recognized. Times change. Users will have different behaviors and patterns. So machine learning is an ongoing, revolving process. You need to keep retraining those models to make sure it's giving you the best potential option there. But we can see that there's a nice, fun report that's also available to me. So this was after I went ahead and I let it train, I applied it, and it brought me this information so I could look at the results of this. And not to go too deep, but this is a classification model. We saw that was right. It was a binary prediction, a binary classification. One of the main methods of metrics to examine the predictive power of this model is called the AUC, or the area under the curve. And you can see it right here. The closer, this is a measurement that goes from 0 to 1, the closer we approach to 1 means higher predictive powers. So this was a 0.94. So this was a very effective predictive model. And there's so much you can examine in here and look into it. This does go more into the realm of data science, so it would require a significant amount more appreciation, understanding of what we have to do here. But it provides a ton of stuff. You want to know what are the top predictor columns? They have a little drop down here that you can look. Apparently page values was one of the features, columns, that had the biggest impact. Right? Page values is something that we indicated where if they were in this page, the value of this page correlating to purchasing, so if it was like the purchase screen or the detail screen of the product, we assigned values to it. So naturally those are going to have impacts, right? Bounce rates, that's obviously going to have an impact whether they're purchasing or not, right? How much are they going in and then just leaving? That's obviously going to have an impact. So all of this is right here. It's pretty cool that we can see this. It's a little, you know, the size of here is a little crazy, but you've got tons of cool little options you can look into. You can check out the accuracy report, the training details, all of it's in here, right? This is what it's all about with the machine learning side. It's a nice wizard that walks you through end to end. And now that it's there, when you're in the AI insights, you can literally just use it and say, you know what? I've got a machine learning model. Here's this data. I'm going to pass it through to it. Give me back those predicted results. Give me back if it's going to be true or false. And the fun part is, just in case, for those who might be familiar to a degree in the machine learning world, of course, it doesn't just do classification models. It can also do regression models, which means predicting, you know, like whole number values, like values, numeric values. So it's a lot. So like I said, I know that's coming at the end. It's more advanced. It comes into a new area of understanding. It's machine learning, data science. It's awesome. We do have some great classes on it on our on-demand learning platform. So, and don't forget, right? That's a big thing. That's why we're here to kind of showcase that, is that right now you can get access to it. If you're like looking into AI and you're interested in that machine learning services, definitely something that you should consider and look at. Check that out. We've got a great discount that's going to be running from now until the 15th, until midnight. Don't also forget that we as well have coming up on August 12th, Brian Knight is going to be with us going over Power App portals. Also something to get signed into. So we are getting down to the wire, guys. We're going to be getting to the end. Like I said, if you had questions in there, I greatly appreciate that. We're going to take the opportunity. We're going to be diving into the process, scrutinizing it. Like I said, I'll look to see if we're going to go with more of a video presentation, maybe a blog or something of that nature. But the main thing I need to say is 3 hours. I know there's people from all around the world, all different time zones. Is thank you. Right? Thank you for being with us throughout this duration, throughout this entire time. I hope we can see you in more Learn with the Nerds, and also I hope I see you inside the on-demand learning platform, asking me questions about the video that you just watched that's giving you more insights on that machine learning or data science, or if you're looking more into the other various Power BI topics, because we're there waiting for you, and we have so many other cool things available to the community. So check it out, on-demand learning, virtual mentoring, the works. But I had a great time. I hope you did too. And like I say in my videos, I'll see you in the next one.